The Fate of Austria. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 276, Difference Engine. Mr. Babbage, with all due respect, you and your machine have a common problem. It is too bloated. Vincenz Augustine, the military's chief weapons manufacturing expert, lamented. In fact, this opinion represents the voice of all experts present. But since almost all of them had purchased or reserved Babbage's difference engine in advance, it was naturally difficult to offend this stubborn wizard in person. In fact, due to the emergence and application of the difference engine, many studies, such as ballistics, can be carried out smoothly. In the past, a ballistics analysis required 20 highly trained actuaries and at least 10 hours a day, and took up to a year to complete. Now with the difference engine, the time for this work has been reduced to only 2 months. Of course, since the weapons of this era were still very substandard, the accuracy of calculations was limited, and it was often ridiculed as a useless subject. This time, the masterpiece Babbage wanted to show was not the difference engine, but the analytical engine he developed. This huge machine, composed of 37,000 parts, is 3.5 meters high and weighs 5 tons. If you include the steam power plant next to it, the total weight is probably close to 10 tons. Mr. Augustine, do you know the proverb that big guys have great wisdom? For example, since my belly can accommodate endless wisdom, it can also do it. Also, please don't ignore me. Assistant Miss Ada. No one likes to be teased about their figure, and Babbage is no exception. Of course, no one wants to say that their baby is bad unless the sun rises in the west one day. In fact, from the perspective of the structure of physiological dissection, your wisdom should be in your brain, not in your stomach. The longest organ in your stomach is called the large intestine, which is filled with feces. Vincenz Augustine sarcastically said. This person is a typical conservative who neither likes Babbage nor can he accept a woman engaging in scientific research. He even called Lady Ada privately Babbage's mistress. However, Babbage did not take the other party's ridicule to heart at all, but concentrated on explaining his creation to the experts present. Gentlemen, are you still satisfied with the simple 4 arithmetic operations and the most basic function calculations? In fact, Babbage's difference engine can already run simple functions, so it attracted the attention of the British government. This invention was a major breakthrough for navigation and astronomy at the time. However, because the British machinery manufacturing industry at that time could not meet Babbage's requirements, it had to be left to fend for itself. The same important part may require more than a dozen masters and dozens of processes in a British factory. After several days and tens of pounds spent, there is still no guarantee that the error will be less than 1,000th point in Austria at this time. It only took a few hours and dozens of florins to complete. In the field of small-scale parts manufacturing, the gap between the two sides can be even more widened by nearly 100 times, because the British cannot set up a production line specifically for this small batch of parts, while the Austrians only need to make a simple mold to achieve mass production. Closer to home, Babbage's science class is still going on, but others present do not seem to be infected by his excitement. So, he asked his assistant, Mrs. Ada, to prepare a very complex and tedious mathematical problem, and planned to give the experts present 5 minutes to calculate it in advance, and then do it himself after 5 minutes. Embarrassingly, it took less than a minute for someone to figure out the correct answer. 5 minutes passed, and half of the people present had already handed in satisfactory answers. Vincenz Augustine looked at Babbage with interest. Although he could not calculate the answer himself, this did not prevent him from waiting for the other party to make a fool of himself with an attitude of gloating. The latter was already accustomed to such embarrassing and deliberately difficult scenes, and was completely unmoved and continued to mind his own business, saying, Ladies and gentlemen, as long as I press this switch, a miracle will happen. At that time, a set of 25 completely accurate numbers will be clearly displayed in front of everyone. At this time, Jin's scientific research giant, who weighed more than 220 pounds, previously 150 pounds, held the lever, and then looked at his assistant, Mrs. Ada. now £160, previously £100. Who gave? He gave an affirmative look point at this moment. Everything around him seemed to be still. Babbage couldn't hear the noise in his heart and only saw his own analytical engine. Witness the miracle. Babbage pulled the lever, and with the roar of the steam engine, the gears began to move at high speed. Babbage looked at his watch. 1 minute had passed, which was the theoretical time, and he shouted to the audience, "Welcome to the future." Just hearing a boom, the Royal Academy for Women in Vienna had to suspend classes for a week due to safety concerns later. According to statistics, a total of more than 20 professors were sent to the Vienna General Academy. Fortunately, no casualties were caused. Of course, the most seriously injured were Babbage himself and Lady Ada, who were closest to the center of the explosion. Fortunately, the fat on their bodies acted as a buffer and they only suffered minor bruises and fractures. The injuries suffered by the rest of the injured are not serious, and considering that they, high-risk individuals, often visit the hospital, this year we will do an experiment of burning a few strands of hair and experience firsthand what it means to have a broken head and a bloody head. Common thing. At this time, Vincent Augustine, who was hit by a flying part and injured his foot, did not forget to mock the two people who were wrapped into rice dumplings, even though he was leaning on crutches. "I sincerely invite you to join my weapons development department. From now on, you can take your invention to France for a seminar and blow up all the French scientists. You will be considered loyal to the country." Babbage still held his head high, ignoring the other party's ridicule, and secretly said in his heart, "I'm an Englishman." Vincent Augustine was speechless when he saw the other party. Feeling that he had won a great battle, he left on crutches. Unfortunately, he happened to collide with a group of little Lalita, and he was drowned out before he could scream. In the sea of Lalita, "This is what you are doing." Babbage looked at the Lalita with small baskets in front of him, feeling a little moved and a little confused. "Teacher, we support you. You must continue your research." "Yes, teacher. We also brought food." "Yes, I made it myself." "Teacher, come on." "Teacher, come on." Some little Lalita even brought Florin to show their sincerity. Obviously these children are not some ignorant brats, it's just that they don't show this to others in person. Instead, they choose to put the money under the food and hide it in the basket. Babbage and Ada were deeply moved. They never expected that so many people would support their hard and noisy work, and they couldn't help but shed tears of excitement. In the future, whenever they feel that the research cannot continue, they will always think of what happened today, and then they will return to their posts with renewed motivation. What they don't know is that the main reason why these Lalita support them is that they want more absentee time. And these two teachers have accomplished what they have always dared not do: bomb the school. Chapter 277 Austrian Imperial Railway Phase 2nd Project. The main line of the Lusitania Railway in Austria is basically completed. People can take a train directly from Tuscany, Italy to Hamburg in North Germany. The journey that took several months now takes 30 hours at this time. In other countries of the German Confederation, except for a few main trunk lines, other railways were still under construction. This provides Austria with a huge advantage. Any area the railway passes through is filled with Austrian goods and cultural imprints. Local residents began to learn South German and even Viennese. Viennese is a mixed language, mainly German. Czech is used in the kitchen. Polish is used when ordering food and calling waiters. Ukrainian is used when swearing, and Latin is used when going to church. It is also used occasionally. Some South Slavic and Gypsy languages, Croatian, Serbian, and Slovenian, were 95% similar at the time. This greatly accelerated the speed of national integration in the three regions of Germany, Austria, and Italy. Italy's traditional aristocracy and local forces were severely impacted, and the emerging bourgeoisie became increasingly dependent on the Austrian government. At this time, Austria did not adopt a policy of appeasement towards northern Italy as it had historically, nor did it adopt an extreme policy of national supremacy to forcibly Austrianize the region. However, local forces that openly clamored for independence and attempted to humiliate and beat soldiers and officials were dealt with in accordance with the law. Small businessmen and capitalists were already suppressed and exploited by local forces, and the actions of the imperial government happened to protect their interests. The taxes levied by the state are simply not worth mentioning compared to the exorbitant levies and miscellaneous taxes and commissions set by the local governments. Naturally, these people had no reason not to support Austria's rule. After all, the only people who suffered were the landlords and wealthy people. On the contrary, they had made huge profits from the elimination of tariffs as for the serfs and workers. They regarded the empire as their savior at this time. The Austrian Empire, Vienna Prague Dresden Railway, Vienna Linz Salzburg Munich Railway, Vienna Graz Udine Venice Milan Parma Modena Lucca Flow. The Linz Railway and the Vienna Brno Lviv Krakow Railway have been completed. The only section that is not open to traffic is Grazl-Ljubljana Trieste. The terrain here is too dangerous and cannot be solved by increasing investment. The first phase of the Austrian Empire's railway project has been basically completed. The main goal of the second phase of construction is to continue to refine the Lusitania railway network and connect Zagreb and Belgrade at the same time. Salzburg, Innsbruck, Feldkirch, Bregenz, Salzburg, Bischofshofen, Sels Valley, Graz-Linz Graz, Vienna Bruck under Moor Klagenfurt Villach Udine. Bruck under Moor Graz, Innsbruck Berliner Udine Milan Prague Brno Brzezov Ostrava Katowice, Brno Brzeclaw Vienna, Prague Pilsen Domazlis Munich, Prague Est Dresden, Prague Wroclaw. The total length is about 15,000 kilometers and it is expected to be completed in 25 years. This was a very reasonable expectation at the time. After all, the previous construction speed of the Austrian Empire was about 300 kilometers per year. However, the above are basically smoke bombs released by France. The only ones that really need to be repaired are a few important trunk lines and the Trieste-Zagreb-Belgrade line. This 550-kilometer railway is expected to be completed in 5 years. It will be completed within the year with a total planned length of 3,000 kilometers. This will ensure that Belgrade will always be under Austria's control. In the event of a war, both water transportation and rail transportation can easily deliver troops and supplies. In fact, the length of railways in the Austrian Empire at this time was already dozens of times that in history. An overly dense railway network was too early for the just starting Austrian Empire. The main reason was that the rate of return was too low, which could easily lead to the emergence of a railway bubble. Infrastructure construction must keep pace with economic development, but investment in infrastructure cannot be too excessive. The length of railways in the Austrian Empire was calculated by experts based on the country's development rate and total cargo volume at this time. Franz was afraid that their figures were too conservative, so he increased them by 50%. After all, the development speed of this era was far beyond the imagination of people at the time. However, future developments showed that France should build the railway according to the customized plan from the beginning, because the country's development speed not only exceeded the imagination of people at the time, but also exceeded Franz's own imagination. At this time, powerful railways, industrial capabilities, cheap raw materials, and an unprecedentedly broad market, coupled with Franz's monopoly plan, colonial and multinational corporate profits, gave the Austrian Empire a qualitative leap in its finances. 310 million florins, already more than twice the amount spent at the same time in the history of the Austrian Empire. The salary of Austrian officials, which has not been increased for 30 years, has finally been increased, and each person's annual income has increased by 10 florins. This may be a drop in the bucket for high-level officials or civil servants living in big cities, but it is a precious reward for those officials living in villages, borders, and mountainous areas. However, Austria's top executives still look off-putting to bankers who come to collect debts. They have been owed money for decades anyway, so they are already used to it. The unwilling bankers used various means and finally bribed Count Korolev to get an answer that only new debts would be repaid, but not old debts. Although they were disappointed, they had to accept this reality. In fact, repaying new debt is to borrow more debt. As for old debt, it depends on luck and mood point of course. In fact, this was not the result of bankers bribing Count Korolov, but the old slippery man's legal corruption, by taking advantage of the information gap point. In fact, although the fiscal revenue of the Austrian Empire has increased significantly compared with the same period in history, it is still too little for this booming country. Every department is scrambling for the budget, including transportation, education, commerce, army, navy, internal affairs, justice, secret police, postal service, industry, agriculture, mining, and fisheries. Each department has its own reasons, and they are all reasons why it must be done. Every annual budget meeting of the empire is like a battle. In the past, when the country ran out of money, all departments were in a zombie state, each one worse than the other. When the empire has money, all departments are like sharks smelling blood, scrambling for their own share of the budget. According to statistics from the last meeting, the Austrian Empire's annual budget is at least 600 million florins. This figure was obtained after cutting the budgets of many departments in half. Based on this calculation, there will still be a deficit of more than 300 million yuan after 1 year, and this day will be impossible. Prince Metternich and Count Korolov had a headache. Archduke Louis was drinking tea leisurely, and Archduke Franz Karol's seat was still vacant. Ferdinand I was still busy eating dumplings, and Baron Sloat, who had survived the disaster, closed his mouth and said nothing. Chapter 278. Alison. Franz came to his laboratory with garlic already prepared. Of course, these garlics are strictly selected. They are undoubtedly mature, dry, free from insects and mildew, and they have been removed from the stems, divided into sections, peeled off the inner bark, washed with clean water, and removed from impurities. It is first mashed into a paste, and then dehydrated at low temperatures. Low temperature dehydration does not mean below zero, but below a certain critical value. For example, 50 to 60 degrees is suitable for garlic. After grinding it into powder, add absolute alcohol, then seal it with a lid to allow the allicin to fully release and dissolve in 24 to 48 hours. Pour it into the filter. To obtain relatively pure allicin, pour it into a chicken heart bottle and heat it to 78 degrees to allow the alcohol to evaporate. The chemical properties of allicin will not be destroyed until it is above 80 degrees. Then it is filtered again, and the purity of the allicin is greatly improved. After low temperature dehydration, it is ground into powder and put into special seaweed capsules. The outside is sealed with a metal hose and can be stored for up to 6 to 12 months. Of course, this is just a laboratory method. In fact, the procedures and methods of industrial production will be slightly different. However, this was Europe in the 19th century, not the late Ming and early Qing dynasties. Mass production of such a simple drug was still possible. After mass production of this thing, a considerable number of quack doctors in the Austrian Empire will be laid off. Of course, it will also lead to the problem of misuse of antibiotics, so the price can only be raised to limit this situation. Since the production cost of this drug is very low, profits will be very high. However, its popularity was not very obvious in the early stage, so the main targets for procurement were still the military and government officials, as well as overseas colonists. Of course, France has no intention of promoting this drug on a large scale in the early stages. There is no doubt that its biggest beneficiaries will be Britain, France and the United States. The consequence was that the colonial efficiency of these countries skyrocketed. Coupled with the existing quinine, there was no need to go through a long process, and the carving up of the world could be completed within just 10 years for Austria. At this time, the colonies it owned had reached the limit that it could support. Building more territories would not only prevent development, but would also increase defensive pressure, so it was meaningless. The most deceptive thing about this thing is that the technology content is extremely low, and it is effortless to copy. Even with the king's technological level at this time, it is only a matter of time before it can be copied. Therefore, even if France gave up 99% of his interests, it would be impossible to slow down the pace of Britain and France. It would be better to directly register a patent and then desperately raise the price so that everyone cannot afford it. So a drug that cost only a few pfennigs was suddenly raised to 20 florins. 1 florin equals 120 pfennig, but its appearance directly revitalized the vitality of the Austrian colony. Together with quinine, it could resist almost all disease threats at that time point, especially in the hot and humid Indochina. The combination of allicin, quinine and bleaching powder has greatly reduced the local mortality rate and the spread of the disease point in the Zhejiang Plain. Those liberated slaves felt as if they had stepped into the paradise world. As long as they were diligent and worked hard, not only would they not enjoy the treatment of whips, but they could also have 3 meals a day and even have private property. Not a problem either. The introduction of various medicines and treatment methods made the locals, or of the mysterious country of the Austrian Empire point. Almost all of the spies sent by Emperor Shaoxi to the Zendler ecclesiastical area to inquire about intelligence were instigated by missionaries to rebel. Naturally, these servants of God would not give up on these lost lambs, so they were sent to Vietnam. After receiving some training and education, these spies also successfully developed downlines, and their tentacles even extended to the royal palace in Hue Point. The results of the First Austro-Vietnamese War also reached Siam, Thailand, at this time. As a peerless wise king, Rama III generously sent a horse, gold, silver, jewelry, and beauties to his powerful neighbor in the east in a timely manner, as well as a series of unparalleled gifts. Treaty of Equality point. Even the iron, or that France had always coveted, was given to Austria, leaving no one with any reason to find trouble point. At the same time, due to the deepening of trade between the two countries, war has gradually become an option with negative returns. In order to ensure that other powers cannot annex Siam, Austria regularly sells weapons to it at low prices. Although Rama III always appears to be at the mercy of others, the equipment in his hands can already equip him with a considerable army point. At the same time, because the great powers made money from Siamese people, those civilians had always firmly supported the royal family to fight against foreign invaders. France didn't know whether a country with the ambition to monopolize Thailand would be attacked by a group of powerful powers, but it was true that they would most likely not be able to take over this country at all point. In fact, the great powers came here to colonize for the purpose of seeking wealth. As long as you can make money, who cares who owns the land? France is naturally no exception. The only previous excuse for war, to fill the gap in iron ore, no longer exists, and there is no reason to adopt the approach of fishing for all the benefits. Moreover, if you are bitten by a fish, or hurt yourself while frying fish, it will be even worse than the loss. Let us turn our attention to Africa. The entire Austrian West Africa, except Namibia, has fallen into cotton fever due to the unprecedented development of the textile industry in the Austrian Empire, which not long ago dominated the entire Central European market. The demand for raw materials has naturally increased exponentially. Point. At this time, only cotton income was stable in its West African colonies. For other commodities, either the price fluctuates greatly, or the demand is unstable, making it impossible to judge the expected returns. In fact, when he visited chiefs in West Africa before, Franz also gave suggestions on promoting coffee, cocoa and rubber. Their point, however, in view of the long growth cycles of those crops, coffee takes 5 years, cocoa takes 4 years, rubber can take up to 8 years, and cotton takes up to 5 months. We finally gave up on this idea temporarily. After all, economic benefits and the laws of crop growth, it cannot be changed artificially. Point. As mentioned before ending his journey to West Africa, Franz gave the local chiefs, or more precisely the future planters, 2 options. One was to trade in the traditional barter mode, and the other was to exchange anticipate banknote purchasing patterns for transactions. The former is mainly about obtaining cheap industrial products and weapons. This model is very familiar to the indigenous people, and they are happy to accept it. In this model, the empire can not only make huge profits, but also dump some of its goods. Few tribes would choose the latter. After all, they did not understand the actual function of these pieces of paper. However, as the first chief who dared to eat crabs appeared, other onlookers discovered that the purchasing power of this expected currency was completely beyond their imagination. Point. Don't underestimate this thin roll of paper. With just this piece of paper, tribal members can go to Austria to freely purchase the supplies they want. The only drawback is that you can only hire Austrian boats, and you have to pay a portion of the cost for the round trip. Point. But these indigenous leaders, who were initially skeptical, saw that this was a perfect opportunity. If they grasped it well, it would be an opportunity for them to leave Africa and join the European Union. Although the direct profits generated by the empire will be slightly less under this model, once those tribes adopt the second model, they will be unknowingly included in the Austrian economic system. In the long run, it is obvious that the latter has higher returns, will have more significant control over the colony, and can also cultivate a group of elite element for free. When all the elites of a country or a nation betray, the success rate of its own resistance is almost zero. This evil balance can only be broken by a stronger external force. Chapter 279 Cosmetics. Franz was concentrating on scribbling and correcting a winter melon the size of a human face on the desk, euphemistically calling it a creation, which surprised Jenny. After all, as far as she knew, although the Grand Duke showed great admiration for the artist on the surface, after contacting him in private, she found that he did not understand art at all, let alone spend time on such trivial matters that had nothing to do with running the country. Out of curiosity, she decided to approach quietly. After walking around the table, she suddenly saw a human face on the winter melon. Ah! Jenny's sharp cry made Franz's eardrums feel the stinging sensation of listening to a soprano singing at close range. Oh my god. Did you mean to scare me to death? Well, can you tell me how a face grows on a winter melon? She said with an extremely exaggerated expression. She even tried to get up several times, but fell down again, because she was immersed in an atmosphere of panic and extreme confusion. This is of course not because she is not smart enough or has little knowledge, but because people of that era have cognitive limitations. It is hard for us to believe that until the 1980s, the top list of Westerners' most feared things was still occupied by werewolves and vampires. The Asian magic used by Franz was completely legendary for Jenny, and even exceeded her imagination. People's fear of the unknown is almost instinctive, which made her look very out of control. What's this? It's just a painting, Franz said casually. Painted? Do you know what you are talking about? How come there are eyebrows on a winter melon? Franz then pulled off the eyebrows from winter melon's face and placed them in front of her. Look carefully. Don't you think she looks a little familiar? The latter shook his head. It's made from the hair you shed. Franz took out another large plate with various powders in it. This is makeup, cosmetics. Jenny gradually understood. It seemed that what was placed in front of her was some kind of high-tech product. It's similar to the mixture of white lead, white wax, and arsenic you used, except that this thing is much safer and has more tricks. Franz has long been dissatisfied with the morbid aesthetics of this era. Whiteness is regarded as beauty. That kind of whiteness is not a healthy whiteness, but a sickly paleness like a dead person. So tuberculosis in this era was called an elegant disease. Some Europeans even take the initiative to get this disease in order to pursue this so-called elegance. Romantic literature at that time highly praised tuberculosis, calling it a love disease. In writers' writings, tuberculosis patients are often portrayed as noble people with romantic tenderness, persistence, elegance, sentimentality and artistic accomplishment. Franz, who came from a later generation, didn't like dead faces, so when a series of cosmetics such as makeup and foundation were developed, he brought them into the palace, preparing to personally take the lead in fundamentally changing the palace and the people's preference for this perverted aesthetic. The East has small feet and the West has a thin waist. Everyone is a pervert. No one can blame anyone. Jenna's eyes moved quickly between the cosmetics, Franz, and the winter melon, trying to confirm the relationship between the three. Franz looked at the other person's expression, as if his brain was overloaded, and couldn't help but say, would you like to experience it for yourself? What did you say? At this time, Jenny completely lost her usual mature, intellectual and confident appearance, like a silly girl who didn't understand anything. Close your eyes. She obeyed. After a quarter of an hour, Franz stopped what he was doing. After all, this Polish lady had a good foundation, and did not need to wear too much makeup to highlight her appearance. Can I open my eyes? Jenny asked. Yes, go look in the mirror, Franz said with a smile. He was quite confident in his masterpiece. Ajani walked to the mirror and was stunned by the sight in front of her. She couldn't believe her eyes, as if she saw herself more than 10 years ago again, and tears suddenly flowed out like broken beads. Don't cry, tears will turn your makeup into mud. After she heard it, she immediately wiped it with her hands subconsciously. Of course, the result became more and more confused. After seeing her makeup and tears turning into mud, she couldn't stop crying. Under this cycle of evil deeds, Ajani's appearance soon turned into a big painted face. Okay, don't be sentimental and go rinse it off. Ajani stubbornly didn't want to leave the mirror and tried to put the makeup back on with her hands. Franz had no choice but to persuade. If you are really reluctant to part with it, why not give you a few sets? You can study it slowly in your spare time in the future. Really? She was immersed in disappointment a few minutes ago and immediately became excited again. After all, there is no upper limit to a woman's pursuit of appearance. When have I lied to you? Go ahead. Cosmetics are designed to be used by people. As my right-hand man, you will naturally receive preferential treatment, Franz said with a smile. Ajani kissed Franz on the cheek excitedly and then rushed to the bathroom. In fact, in addition to these simple cosmetics, there are also some more complex and expensive similar products in the process of being developed. When this project was first proposed, not many professors showed interest in it. Even the cosmetics in Franz's hands were made by himself by mixing kaolin plus clay plus natural dyes. However, hard work paid off, and several professors finally changed their initial attitudes. There were even students at the Royal Academy for Women in Vienna who began to study chemistry in preparation for devoting themselves to this research that they regarded as highly mysterious. The price of cosmetics during this period was ridiculously high. A bottle of soja lotion usually cost between 1 and 20 gold louis, and the most expensive could even reach 200 gold louis. Note: 1 gold louis equals 20 francs. The cost of these cosmetics is usually less than 1 franc, so if this advantage can be better utilized, and with the effective cooperation of industrial model production, the cost can be further reduced. At this time, the price of cosmetics on the Austrian Empire market usually ranged from 10 to 100 florins. However, the most expensive one was a rose essential oil that cost up to 15,000 florins. Franz aimed at the mid to high-end market. After all, given the poor spending power and desires of the poor at that time, they were not able to enjoy expensive luxury jewelry. Therefore, he was confident that his products could easily beat those on the market at that time. Similar products at the same time, it can rely on enough influence to compete with those merchants for market share. Just the word royal can be worth the hundreds of years of painstaking efforts and sky-high advertising expenses of those merchants. However, he still had some misunderstandings about the cosmetics market at that time. That is, the era of metallic foundation had passed, replaced by rice powder and pearl powder. Taking white as beauty is just a taste of the upper class. On the contrary, pink makeup has won the love of the emerging citizen class in the city, so the rouge box is the mainstream of this era. Ruddy cheeks are considered a sign of good health, so women often use blush or rouge to brighten their appearance. However, the foundations and cosmetics of this era were still mainly single-toned, which was still several grades behind the makeup developed by Franz. As for the production of high-priced rose essential oil, liposuction was still used at that time, which not only consumed a lot of manpower and time, but was also a huge waste of raw materials. The simplest method in the industrial era is of course the distillation method. The principle is to use the insoluble nature of oil in water to achieve large-scale oil-water separation. This is simple, effective and cheap. The purified industrial product is actually close to the effect of liposuction. In fact, even if the liposuction method is used, the price of the product has not changed, so Franz is very sure to win by this method. After all, the strength and status of the two parties are not at the same level. Of course, this prince who admires the fierce collision of technology will not drive people to death. He will leave a part of the market share for the other party. Even if the other party is willing, they can join his industry and become one of its departments. Chapter 280: The Magical Industrial Age of the 19th Century. From a profit perspective alone, heavy industry cannot be compared with light industry. Take clothing and cosmetics, two daily necessities, for example. It is no joke for manufacturers to earn exaggerated profits of tens, hundreds or even thousands of times. But suppose we completely remove the value and role of heavy industry from the process of a country's industrialization, what will be left? In a word, industrialization without heavy industry is like a castle piled on the beach, with gold and jade on the outside, but ruins on the inside. It can be said that it will fall down at a touch point. Since the late 1970s and early 1980s, Americans have engaged in deindustrialization for decades. In the end, they can only rely on exaggerating the so-called external threat theory to divert the attention of the people and save their country through more crazy plunder. Decline point. The role of heavy industry is that it can process industrial raw materials into semi-finished products and then provide them to light industry factories. In addition, the former can also produce a variety of parts and hardware equipment through mechanical manufacturing to deliver supplies to the supply chain. Point. In general, only when a country has truly established a relatively complete heavy industry system can it complete the first step of not getting stuck. The outbreak of the First Austro-Vietnam War meant that Austria entered the door of industrialization with both feet. Over the years, as the boom in railway construction and industrial development continued to deepen, a large number of steel mills thrived in the empire like the sleeping earth coming to life after the spring rain, and steel production also continued to rise. But for the ever-expanding demand gap, this scale is still a drop in the bucket. Facing the snowflakes of letters from factory owners, businessmen, and capitalists, the senior officials of the Imperial government had to consider whether to countries such as Luxembourg and Prussia imported steel to fill domestic shortfalls. The amount of capital required for the development of heavy industry has always been large, and the long return cycle and slow results have extremely tested the patience of the rulers. This is why most of the countries in Europe that first started to industrialize relied on colonial plunder to accumulate their first pot of gold. The most typical of them are Britain and France. Of course, countries that cannot take the path of external colonial expansion have to rely on squeezing internal resources to obtain valuable funds, such as the woolly bears of later generations. However, with the development of industrialization and the increasing demand for capital, the modern financial industry has been born and expanded to help finance heavy industries such as Belgium, Luxembourg and the United States. The Americans are very cheating, but they are also the first country to harvest European capital in reverse. Historically, the US government and its local consortium have frantically sought financing from Europe on several occasions, and have repeatedly insisted that their potential is much higher than that of Belgium. Then they invested in some projects, and the remaining resources were invested in real estate. Later, when a series of economic crises broke out, these projects went bankrupt in turn. At this time, European capital tried to withdraw from North America. However, in order to pass on the economic crisis, the cunning Americans adopted various means to limit and refuse capital outflows, and then also took the British with them into a trap. The British, unwilling to be left alone, certainly would not sit back and watch themselves suffer while other countries watched this happen. As a result, almost the entire Europe was dragged into the water invariably and became victims of economic crisis of varying degrees. This is the tip of the iceberg of this economic crisis that was discussed in the previous book, so I won't go into details here. But in any case, the ultimate beneficiary is the United States, and these capitals finally fell into their hands, and our protagonist Franz just took the opportunity to get a share of the pie because he knew about this past event. Anyway, Europe was suffering from capital surplus at that time, and the leak would not be cut until it was cut, and this debt will not be placed on the Austrians. After all, it was the Americans who directly introduced a bill to forcefully keep the wallets of those Europeans. Furthermore, no one in history had ever retaliated against them, and not even a symbolic sanction had been issued, so Franz felt comfortable taking advantage. There is also a fourth way, which is to slowly promote industrialization through the country's own market, such as Prussia and Austria. However, the future Prussians successfully counterattacked with the help of the British. Even though they later received huge war indemnities from the French, their inherent shortcomings of being a cripple still did not change. Compared with their northern neighbor, the Austrians' path to industrialization was much more miserable, because it has not received Help from foreign capital and domestic capital has been flowing crazily to Prussia and France. Its industrialization has progressed extremely slowly. Historically, there was a French consortium that planned to support Austria, but was stopped by Napoleon III. In this life, due to the sudden emergence of Franz, a man from heaven, Austria gained some overseas colonies to help it expand its trade circle. However, it is too wishful thinking to expect that these few areas can complete the industrialization of a big country. In addition, due to the twists and turns of this butterfly, foreign capital can be said to have basically no chance of Austria. Neither John Bull nor Gallic Chicken wanted a Central European empire to become powerful due to the resurgence of its power countries such as Prussia and Belgium, that are still in the process of industrialization, have no spare capacity to help. As for the huge furry bear in the east, he really wanted to lend money to this important ally of one of the three northern palaces, but he was really unable to do so. Now, both domestic and external markets can be said to have expanded to the limit. If you want to expand further, you can only rely on war or colonial means, but for France, who has always been prepared, Austria's confidence lies in having the two major markets of Germany and the Apennines. However, in addition to the four paths that have appeared in history, as a time traveler, you can also choose a fifth path, which is technological innovation. Technology is the primary productive force. France is convinced of this. The current mainstream steel making method in Europe is still the crucible method invented in the 18th century. This method is to cut the carburized iron material into small pieces and place them in a closed clay crucible. When heated outside the crucible, the iron material continues to absorb the carbon in the graphite and melts into high carbon molten steel. It is cast into small ingots and then forged into various shapes. Required shape. This was the first method of producing liquid steel in European history, but the disadvantage was that the content was small and the cost was quite high. In addition, there is also the bubble steel method. That is, a good iron rod is placed in a furnace and heated with charcoal for 10 days to increase the carbon content. After reaching a certain hardness, bubbles appear on the surface, which is called bubble steel. If you want to improve toughness and strength, you need to work hard on heating and beating point. Although there were already foamed steel methods that carburized wrought iron and cast steel methods that made steel in crucibles, the production of foamed steel required a 10-day carburization process, and the primary output of cast steel just a few dozen kilograms. Moreover, both methods have the disadvantages of high cost, unstable quality, low efficiency, and limited output. A large amount of scrap steel flows into the market and is made into inferior steel cannons. It seriously hindered the development of military technology at that time. After all, every test of artillery may be the last one in life. At this time, the output of steel was less than 1/40th of that of iron, and the price was very different. At that time, the price of steel was around £60 per ton, while the price of pig iron was only £3 and the price of wrought iron was only £9. At that time, in order to cope with the shortage of steel production, Europeans invented a third steel making method, which was the stirring method. This method has even been praised by great teachers, saying it is a great progress in human history. However, this is just an old road traveled by the East for 2000 years. The stirring method is just an upgraded version of the Han Dynasty steel frying method, and it does not fundamentally improve the efficiency of steel making. In this magical era of the 19th century, there is nothing that this group of people cannot do, unless you can imagine it. The magical steel making method that has spanned thousands of years has once again become the mainstream of society. People can't help but marvel at the wisdom of the ancients and feel sorry for the people at that time. Chapter 281 Steel Making Method. Franz's favorite was the Bessemer method, which was later known as the converter method. Of course, he does not intend to repeat the detours Bessemer has taken, such as the issue of acid-base properties. The acidic converter method cannot remove sulfur and phosphorus, which results in huge waste and reduced quality. The alkaline converter method uses a converter with an alkaline lining to process high phosphorus pig iron and dumps slag to remove sulfur. This process is slightly complicated, and I will not write it in detail. Why didn't Franz adopt the more efficient Martin method in later generations? Because the initial investment of the Martin method is too high. The cycle is long, the reaction time is slow, there are fewer types of steel that can be manufactured, the energy consumption is serious, the inherent shortcomings cannot be overcome, and the upper limit is to low point converter steel making is obviously more flexible, which is suitable for a country like Austria, where steel companies are very dispersed. After Austria adopts the alkaline converter method, steel production can be increased by 8 to 10 times. However, given the current market situation of short supply, the price of steel will not drop too much. France can take the opportunity to earn high profits, expand production capacity, and occupy the market earlier than other powers. In fact, the Bessemer method has been completed a long time ago, but there are still many flaws, and the timing is not right. Plattner Carl Friedrich, who was responsible for research on converter steel making, was a talented metallurgist from Saxony, and the other was Redson Bacher, an Austrian born in Stier, who had as a cleaner at the Vienna Institute of Engineering. I attended for 2 months, and then went to Switzerland, to become a famous engineering expert, and one of the founders of mechanical engineering. In fact, Franz originally planned to invite Krupp and Siemens, but the former's business was prosperous and popular, and he refused to accept Austria's invitation, and committed a traitorous act. The latter was because he stole a donkey, and pulled out a peg, and he watched others fight. As a result, they ran away, and he was imprisoned. It was obviously a duel between 2 officers, but in the end it was 2 soldiers who ended up in prison, one of whom was Siemens. In fact, it was not difficult for Franz to fish him out, but Siemens was a prisoner who attracted much attention, because even in prison, he was still researching science and technology, and his inventions were even valued by the Prussian military. Finally, through the operation of some Junker nobles, he was pardoned by an amnesty order personally signed by King Frederick William IV of Prussia. If France comes up with this at this time, it will definitely become big news. In order to avoid capitalizing on the enemy, it is reasonable for the Prussian military to directly kill this great inventor in human history. The level of Plattner and Bacher is not inferior to these 2 geniuses, who have left their names in history, but there are some problems with the direction of their research. The top-blown converter technology, that became unparalleled more than 100 years later, was one of the products of the combination of their inventions. The 2 were experts in metallurgical engineering, and with the cooperation of a group of professionals, they quickly developed the Bessemer method. As for the issue of alkaline furnace lining, although the 2 of them didn't understand what Franz was going to do, it didn't stop them from working. The new alkaline refractory bricks are made by mixing dolomite and tar, which are clinker fired at high temperatures. After several experiments, they discovered the brilliance of this alkaline furnace lining, and could not help but begin to admire this genius who had grown up in the palace. When Franz came to the factory, where they were experimenting again, the 2 had already picked up their notes and benches. Archduke Franz, the experiment has been completed. This brand new technology will cause an industrial revolution. The existing blowers may not be able to meet your needs, so we have invented a brand new blower. Franz looked at this so-called new blower. In fact, the technological content was not high. It just added a few blades to the original blower, and the power became a steam engine. The only design that was beyond this era was the air duct. We have to admire human wisdom. Historically, this kind of industrial blower was not invented by Americans until 1867. The invention of this high-efficiency fan can further increase steel production. Of course, the air blown in at this time still contains 78% useless nitrogen, which is still a huge waste. However, industrial oxygen concentrators require the help of electricity, and electricity at this time is still a scarce resource. It's a great invention, but the efficiency of the steam engine is too low. The Navy has a steam turbine technology that can increase the efficiency of your invention by 500%. 500%? Oh my god. But what's the use of blowing in so much air? It's mainly nitrogen, and it can't burn. Then, why don't you try removing the nitrogen and injecting pure oxygen directly? Franz said. After all, he knows the direction of historical development. The top-blown converter method is still the most widely used steel-making method today. Moreover, the Austrians after World War II also used the inventions of these 2 men. Pure oxygen. How much water do we need to electrolyze? Plattner immediately thought of electrolyzing water to create oxygen. That's Such a waste of electricity. Batcher said. Obviously, the price of electricity at that time was painfully expensive. When the steam turbine arrives, maybe you can find the answer from it. Franz's words made the two professors more interested in the mysterious steam turbine. In fact, modern American aircraft carriers use steam turbines to drive power generation, which does not reduce their own thermal efficiency and helps reduce fuel consumption. It is a good way to kill two birds with one stone. In fact, Franz thought too much. Electricity at this time was still in its infancy. Not to mention the two of them who were engaged in metallurgical machinery. Even electric power experts couldn't do it. Is that machine really as magical as you said? The two of them couldn't help asking, full of doubts and expectations. Let's wait and see. Franz did not give a clear reply, because he knew that these engineering people believed in what they saw, and even if you told them about smallpox, these people would not believe it. Now, this technology is close to maturity and can be put into production. Our country will definitely be able to achieve self-sufficiency in steel. No, we can eat the entire German steel market. The two professors gave their own judgment. No, I don't plan to promote this technology yet. It will only be used in the royal factory. This technology needs to continue to be improved. In fact, Franz just wants to make a wave of technological dividends first. Selling patent rights is indeed a good idea, but if you can't resist it, there will always be rogue countries who have solutions. For example, in history, after Bessemer registered a patent in the United States, an American immediately jumped out and said that he invented this method. In order to invent Bessemer's steel-making method, this American conducted secret research alone, and it was not until the Bessemer method became popular in Europe that he jumped out. The mysterious American inventor who called Bessemer a thief and a liar immediately received support from the US government, which cancelled Bessemer's patent and awarded it to this mysterious man. Soon the mysterious man had to sublicense the patent rights to the US government due to bankruptcy. So far, the US government not only obtained Bessemer's patent without spending a penny, but also collected a layer of money from US steel companies every year. Wool. Chapter 282 Farmers working hard in Pomerania. Berlin, Charlottenburg Palace. Since the establishment of the German customs union, Prussia's fiscal revenue has been on a steady upward trend, with total tariffs nearly tripling, from 18 million florins to 54 million florins, accounting for 39% of its total revenue. But this favorable situation did not reveal expressions of relief and pride on the faces of its monarch, William IV, and his advisors, because the excessive financial burden of this military-owned country means that, if war suddenly comes one day, its financial situation will deteriorate sharply, and a large deficit may even directly crush the country. What's even more frightening is that the factory and commodity production structure in Prussia is quietly changing. And the person who realizes all this is a farmer from Pomerania. In an investigation report written to the Prussian government, he pointed out that, although the output value of the kingdom's textile industry had nearly doubled after joining the German customs union, 25 of the 97 textile factories in the country closed down one after another within 7 years. 80% of the reasons for the closure of these 25 textile factories were due to poor management. In this era of rapid development of the textile industry, how to define poor management? What is the main reason behind it? The answer is obvious: Austrian competition. Anyone who has entered an emerging industry and wants to get a share of the blue ocean will be wiped out by these guys, who take advantage of every opportunity. The blood of those pioneers quickly dyed the ocean blood red. The sudden increase in entry barriers caught Prussian factory owners and businessmen by surprise. They either chose to surrender and be acquired by the Austrians, or they could only keep their 1/3 of an acre of land through blood transfusions. However, their Austrian counterparts are backed by state endorsement, and the methods they use are endless. In addition to common business practices, they can even manipulate raw material prices and bribe officials of other countries. There is a terrible logic behind this behavior. That is, if you don't want to stay as a dog, then you shouldn't do it as a human either. In fact, this is not surprising. After all, in order to make money in this era, not to mention the capitalists, even the countries that claim to be maintenance of order have already done everything they can. But this keen farmer gave his analysis The Austrian Empire was deliberately turning the Kingdom of Prussia into an agricultural-based source of raw materials. This made the junker landowners who made a lot of money even help Austria. It's not difficult to tell someone's attitude towards this matter just by talking about it. However, the foundation of a strong country lies in self-reliance. The farmer's words are heartbreaking. But it also caused dissatisfaction among other junker landowners. After all, they did not think that this was taking advantage of Austria, but just profiting from free trade. Your Majesty, this rough farmer is too arrogant. Who is he and dares to discuss state affairs? War Minister Gustav von Rauch frowned. In his eyes, this ignorant country bumpkin was threatening the interests of the entire junker aristocracy. After tasting the sweetness of the food crisis, the latter discovered that they should not plant too much grain, because too much grain will lead to a drop in grain prices. So the best way to maintain price stability is to reduce the planting area of grains. However, simply reducing the area of grain cultivation will cause a large amount of land and labor to be idle. Unfortunately, due to conflicts with Hungary, Austria needs to import a large amount of Prussian sugar beets and feed, and the improvement of the German Confederation's railway network has greatly reduced the cost of exporting crops within the kingdom. The short-sighted junkers naturally had no reason to give up this opportunity to make money, and one after another switched to planting sugar beets and feed. As for the potential threat of food shortage, they confidently believed that it could be solved by the Russians next door. After all, their monarch's brother-in-law was Tsarnakilasai. No matter what way or channel, the problem would be properly handled. Under the guidance of this idea, the Prussians planted a large number of crops such as pasture, barley, oats, black beans, and sugar beets on their farmland. Of course, the source of their confidence is also closely related to their eastern allies. After all, Imperial Russia was the largest exporter of agricultural products in Europe at the time, so it would be beneficial and harmless to earn more trade surpluses. The Tsarist government did not mention a word about the previous betrayal, and the junker nobles who traded with it would naturally selectively forget it. For the Tsarist government, the international situation faced at this time had not fundamentally changed. The people of the islands in the west continue to worry about the Strait issue, but if they really give up the Winkery-Scalisi Treaty, it will be equivalent to giving up the advantageous position they have gained in the Strait over the years. In fact, the real beneficiaries of Britain's so-called international condominium proposal will only be themselves. Other major powers have neither the inclination nor the strength to be entangled in the competition for Black Sea hegemony at this time. What's more, their proposal still has many imperfections. For example, the substantive content related to international condominium has been vague, and there is no mention of its wartime status. It can be said that the Straits Convention proposed by the British was the trigger for the Crimean War. The Polish Nationalist Army and the Polish Democratic League in the country are constantly causing trouble for His Majesty the Tsar. Although the power of the Tsar seems ridiculous now, the several campaigns against them have ended with little effect, which is enough to prove their strong vitality. The most fundamental reason why the Poles in Russia were able to fight and lose again and again like an unbeatable little power was that they had the three great powers of Britain, France, and Austria standing behind them. The friendship between France and Poland has a long history, and France once helped Poland recover during the Napoleonic Wars. Although Louis Philippe did not have a good impression of the Bonaparte family, he coveted their inheritance for a long time. In the eyes of French senior officials, of course, the Poles must make good use of such useful chess pieces. As the saying goes, one hand can determine the fate of heaven and earth. After all, at this time, Poland has the final say whether Eastern Europe will be in chaos or not. The ancestors of France throughout the ages never concealed their ambitions for the Rhineland and northern Italy. Now both places are occupied by enemies of the anti-French alliance, not to mention their solid ally Russia, which was the biggest culprit that led to the decline of the First French Empire. Before the Napoleonic Wars, France was a very powerful colonial empire. After the defeat, almost all overseas interests belonged to the British, so it is wrong to say that the Peace of Vienna did not weaken France. Although the British paid a lot, they were also the biggest winners. As long as Poland does not give up its dream of independence, the three Russian, Prussian, and Austrian families will never have peace. As long as they make a big enough noise, they may eventually turn into a war like the Greek War of Independence. At that time, active and British intervention will further weaken the Holy Alliance, a stumbling block that has existed for many years. At the same time, the July dynasty was full of pro-British factions from the king to the cabinet. Standing with Britain has always been their dream point for their continental balance of power policy. John Bull can choose to support the Carolists in the Iberian Peninsula. Of course, they can also support the Polish Restoration Forces. Coupled with the conflicts with the Maozian in the Near East, they are very happy to see the Tsar's house. Firepoint. Although historically from the time of Poland's first subjugation to World War II, the British never truly fulfilled their promises to them, the latter had always had faith in the former. Austria was the biggest contributor to the Polish rebels' ability to retreat several times. Due to the existence of the natural barrier of the Free City of Krakow, Russia was never able to completely eliminate the Polish rebels. Krakow was nominally a free city, but was protected by the Austrian Empire. To send troops there without authorization is to declare war on this ancient empire that has been entrenched in Central Europe for hundreds of years. In fact, Krakow was reserved by the Austrians to disgust the Russians. Its main function is to prevent the continued spread of Big Slavism. Moreover, this city has actually been included in Austria's sphere of influence for a long time. Because of this, Krakow became the center of the Polish independence movement and the largest refuge for its restorers. After all, I stopped updating for a day and I didn't want to mess it up, so I changed it a few times and wasted time. Please forgive me. Chapter 283 Giant Seal. Poland was not the only hidden danger within Russia. What caused the Tsar more headaches were the mountain people living in the Caucasus, Siberian tribes and Cossacks. The Cossacks had been dependent on Tsarist Russia since 1654. Cossack comes from the Turkic language, meaning free man or plunderer. It was originally worshipped and revered by the Russians. Although they were of humble origin, they longed for freedom and were unwilling to surrender. The rise of the Cossacks was a huge threat to southern Russia. At that time, Alexei adopted a soft policy, using religion and money to corrupt its top brass and make them work for their own advantage. This trick really worked. However, the Cossacks played little role in frontal large-scale battlefields and did not reflect their talent for doing evil. At the same time, these herdsmen are a double-edged sword with a big tail. The Cossacks only obeyed the leaders of their own tribes, and they often had disputes because of disobedience to Russian commands. Even going so far as to kill the messenger. Capriciousness is also their main characteristic. Afterwards, successive Tsars took measures to strengthen their control over the Cossack tribes, such as cancelling the democratic voting rights of the Ataman chief, prohibiting them from accepting free people to join, and forcibly moving some Cossacks to other places. The most important method used was to maintain a delicate balance between dispersing and consuming its power, in order to allow it to participate in the conquest of Siberia. Compared with frontal battlefields, hunting and looting were what the Cossacks were best at. In the following hundreds of years, the indigenous people of Siberia suffered terrible annihilation. During the Napoleonic Wars, the Cossack regiment began to have a formal establishment. There was no way around this. After all, Russia was already at a disadvantage at the time and had to mobilize all available forces. But the Cossacks are still different from the Russian army and are still based on tribal communities. It was not until Nicholas I came to power that the Cossacks were forcibly organized into military districts. In the second year of Nicholas I's reign, he invited the Cossack chiefs around the Don River to St. Petersburg to receive rewards. This is a Russian tradition, and every Tsar who has just ascended the throne will use this method to win over the Cossacks. However, about 1/3 of the Cossack leaders were not present. In fact, everyone had already tacitly understood this. Those who were not present were the leaders of some powerful tribes. The largest tribe had 5,000 soldiers alone. These tribes, with a combined number of more than 100,000, are definitely a force that cannot be underestimated on the southern Russian prairie. Even if the Tsar is angry again, he can only change this situation by persuading him and increasing the rewards for all Cossack tribes. Every Tsar wanted to weaken the Cossacks, and naturally this group of freedom-loving people could not be allowed to be slaughtered by them. So they came up with this method to embarrass the Tsar, while not ignoring their existence. But what they were waiting for was not an envoy with gifts, but the cavalry of Nicholas I's cavalry. The Russian army attacked the most powerful Cossack tribe in the Don River basin with a strong force of 40,000 people. Cossacks are also known as cannibals in Siberia. However, in front of real war machines, they are as pitiful and helpless as the indigenous people they massacred. The slaughtered tribe quickly disappeared in the long river of history, and the heads of the chief and his male heir were sent to St. Petersburg. The massacre did not stop. After the first tribe was wiped out, the Tsar's Guards cavalry rushed towards the second tribe non-stop. After the reforms of Peter I, Russia no longer allowed cutting off ears and heads to record merit. If the leaders of the Guards cavalry want to show off their achievements, they can only do so by building landscapes. As a result, a large number of corpses were piled together to create various landscapes. But now it is just a prototype. Only when the wild wolves and goshawks eat up the flesh and blood on the corpse can the true face of the work be seen. As more and more heads of Cossack tribal leaders were sent to St. Petersburg for exhibition, a Cossack leader named Migo jumped out to accuse the Tsar of the brutal rule. He called on all Cossacks to unite to fight against this evil tyrant. However, no one responded to Migo's call. The young Cossack leader was quickly arrested and sent to Nicholas I. Facing Nicholas I, who was 2.05 meters tall and strong. Even the unruly goshawks on the grassland showed fear that Tsar drew Migo's scimitar and broke it with his bare hands before him. Nicholas I is said to be very strong, and one of his biggest hobbies is to break people with a sword. As for why he doesn't wear a sword, because he basically dealt with Cossacks and Tatars. Your Majesty, the great Tsar, I'm willing to kiss your boots and be your most loyal servant. Migo knew that he could not defeat the man in front of him. Although Nicholas I had just become Tsar, he was under great pressure. How many times have I heard this kind of oath? Nicholas I did not speak. He just patted Migo on the shoulder, then picked up the broken knife from the ground and used the knife to cut off the opponent's head bit by bit. The surrounding Russian military attaches and Cossack leaders watched quietly, with only the sounds of knives cutting flesh and blood splattering. Similar things happened every year after that, and the Cossacks at that time had a song. Over the Volga, over the Kama, the free Cossacks live forever. The great chiefs whispered to their companions, the indomitable Cossacks, my compatriots, when summer passes and winter comes, where will our shelter be? Huddled in the Volga, hiding from the light of day like a thief, or raid Kazan and challenge the Tsar. But the Tsar sent 40,000 troops. How could we resist them? We need to find another way out. Find another way out. Come with me, brothers, let us advance towards Siberia. However, the Tsar did not stop at the southern Russian steppes, but gradually strengthened his control over the Cossacks. Any tribe that dared to resist would be wiped out. The Ataman system was finally abolished under the strong hand of Nicholas I. After that, Russia divided the Cossacks into military districts. By 1837, 10 Cossack military districts had been established in Russia. This marked a new height for St. Petersburg's control of the Cossacks. At that time, Nicholas I believed that the Cossacks are a group of hungry wolves and have no so-called loyalty. Once Russia is weak, they will probably be the first to rise up and join the rebels. So, Russia needs to stay strong, and so does the rebellion in the Caucasus. The Chechens, Georgians, Dagestanis and Ingush people in the Caucasus Mountains are not easy to conquer. Historically, they continued to resist from the early 19th century until the giant Russia fell in Crete. The two sides only temporarily compromised. The successive governors of the Caucasus were all ruthless characters. Starting from the first governor Alexei Yermolov, they established the combat principle of killing without mercy and showing no mercy. Enemies and rebels could be killed on the spot without trial. They will be executed. The enemy's family members will also be killed together, leaving no survivors. Local women can be kidnapped at will, or used as trophies in later generations of British and American propaganda. Yermolov was an out-and-out executioner, even burning millions of acres of forest in order to eliminate local guerrillas. He said in a letter to Tsonicholas I just want my orders to be more feared by the locals than the call of death. In the eyes of Asians, kindness is cowardice. Don't say I'm inhumane. What I do is truly humane. Every execution of Caucasians. This means that hundreds of Russians are spared from death, and it also means that thousands of barbarians dare not rebel. I'm a Russian soldier, and being humane to the Russians is true humanity. Although Nicholas I later dismissed him and recalled him to St. Petersburg, Yermolov's successors continued his policies until a governor named Yuskinov Petrovich took office. The situation in the Caucasus had tended to ease. Then he took the opposite measures from his predecessors. He ordered the soldiers to treat them like family members. Local people. The governor planned to build hospitals, schools, churches, and a cannery to solve local employment problems. Then the most serious rebellion in history broke out in the Caucasus, and the Chechens gave back to the Russians exactly what the Russians had done. They strangled hostages, massacred the old, weak, women and children, and razed villages to the ground. The naive governor and his family were beaten for a week and then cut into thousands of pieces for human consumption. Compared with the tough peoples in the Cossacks and Caucasus, the demands of the Siberian indigenous people are very mild. They do not want revenge and just want to get their land back. Others, such as the Decembrists and the Apostles, were not scabies. In Franz's eyes, Russia's most terrifying enemy, Nicholas I, did not realize that it was the pro-British faction within Russia. These people are short-sighted and try to please Britain at the expense of Russia's interests, so as to achieve the goal of hegemony, which is the so-called co-hegemony of the world. This is simply whimsical. Historically, it was this group of people who ruined Russia's centuries-old advantages and momentum after the Napoleonic Wars, and caused the country to develop in another direction during the Crimean War. Although Austria and Russia have many conflicts and even often plot against each other, with the latter standing in the way, the former can have a lot more development time, which is crucial for Austria. A lot of dialogue has been deleted to prevent you from saying that I'm short on word count. There are still 2 poems written in the words of the writer. In addition, these words are not counted, so I deliberately counted them. Thanks to book friend Lugichan, Dimension's strongest kindergarten small class, joint command, GLLL, Tang Monk's Hair Wash Rejoice 00, and Zodiac Sen for their awards. It is stated that this book has nothing to do with the real universe, and is a parallel universe. The views expressed in the book do not represent personal views, so please do not take them personally. Captives of the Caucasus. Pushkin. When the eagle of Russia, flying over the top of the Caucasus, as Russia's war drum, beat bloody drums, can I sing for this glorious moment, sing for you, my respected hero. Your footprints are in every corner of the tribe. You are the proud son of Gaojashi. In front of you, Russia's butcher's knife is also bent. In the light of swords and shadows, you become more brave as you fight, but the armor shines like the sun and moon. A mount galloping on the battlefield, the mountains that gave birth to you and raised you, and your beloved freedom, neither can escape from the hand of death. Take you back, Chechen. Folk song. Wake up, my warrior, wake up your family, wake up your wife, finish your morning prayers quickly. The village has been heavily surrounded. A cold forest of guns, a shining net of knives, a wall of bloody corpses. The executioner ordered, no old, weak, women or children were left behind. Suddenly, dead bodies piled on top of each other. The sun and moon eclipsed. Open the 20th Sutra / sing a death prayer, my warrior. At this moment, your soul will ascend to heaven. The heathen will never again be able to keep up with you. 20th will hold you in my arms, eternally free from suffering. Every blade of grass, every stone, all remember the suffering and violence in this land. Your blood dyes the enemy's sword red. It also dyed this land red. I can't see the child with tears in his eyes, in front of my mother's body, weeping sadly. Consider yourself lucky. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 284. Josephism. Back to the story. Under the collective protest and strong pressure of the Junker landowners, the farmer was quickly dismissed from his post and has never been reinstated. The predicament the kingdom fell into was simply attributed to economic factors and nothing else. If Franz, who was far away in Vienna, saw the investigation report at this time, he would definitely cry out that he was wronged. In the conscience of heaven and earth, He had no intention of using Prussia as a source of raw materials. Firstly, this would be a waste of great land and talent, and secondly, Liebig's paper has been published throughout Europe, and the European continent will soon usher in an agricultural revolution. Unless you are insane, trying to change Prussia's production structure by purchasing large amounts of agricultural products at this time is equivalent to a useless effort, and will not help the current and future strategic layout plans. As for the surge in demand for sugar beets and feed, it is entirely because Austria's economic development is showing a positive development trend. People's income has increased, and they have more money than before, so they will naturally be interested in a higher and better standard of living. There are certain pursuits, such as food and clothing, sugar and meat, of course. One thing the Junker landowners were right about was that the estrangement between Hungary and Austria was showing signs of deepening, especially the recent farce of slave trade under the guise of rescuing disaster victims through immigrants. Not to mention the kidnapping of the royal prince. All of the above made the merchants of Nellitania begin to hate the appearance of the Magyars. In addition, the increasingly improved railway transportation and tariffs with foreign countries in Nellitania gave them more opportunities. Choice. The participation of Austrian businessmen coincided with the needs of the Junker nobles to reduce grain production and switch to other crops to increase income. Then the two hit it off, causing sugar beet and feed to become a sharp knife in the hands of the Prussians. At this time, the area between the Ruhr and Lippe rivers, the lower tributaries of the Rhine, was still surrounded by rows of small workshops and simple shacks. But in a few years, this area would become the heart of German industry, the Ruhr, a district. At this time, no one could have imagined that this place would become the capital that Prussia relied on to unify Germany, and the Second Empire launched a world war. At the Congress of Vienna 26 years ago, Metternich took the initiative to throw this bad land to this holy alliance. A lie. Among them is a large steel workshop with only 130 people that produces kitchen utensils, farm tools, and solid shell steel. Its name is the famous Krupp steel. In later generations, Friedrich Krupp AG. A heated discussion was taking place in the factory where the forging hammered, and one participant gave a completely different opinion than Berlin's top brass and most onlookers. Economic invasion? No, I think the Austrians want more than just money and markets. What really interests them is population and talent. Ah, you sure? There are already 38 million Austrians today. Even the remaining members of the German Confederation combined cannot compare with them. Alfred Krupp, the current head of Krupp Company, retorted. The combined population of the other members of the German Confederation at this time was 32.6 million. In Europe, the figures are roughly 63 million in Russia, 34 million in France, and 27 million in the United Kingdom. This data is inaccurate, and the European mainstream at that time expelled Russia from European citizenship. You are right. But maybe you have forgotten that the German population only accounts for 20% of them. If the Habsburg family wants to strengthen its rule, it must rely on us Germans. The young man said, "Oh, dear Otto, are you saying that the Josephites have occupied the mainstream in Vienna again?" Alfred Krupp couldn't help laughing. After all, if it weren't for that ridiculous emperor, this southern neighbor would now be probably not that weak. There have been more than one monarchs and ministers in history who wanted to strengthen the centralization of Austria by introducing a large number of Germans, and the most recent one to do so was Joseph I. As the eldest son of Queen Issa, he inherited a Habsburg dynasty that had been transformed by the Queen for nearly half a century. His mother ruled this jigsaw puzzle of feudal empire with extremely skillful skills, and even the most arrogant aegis of God learned to surrender. At the same time, she joined forces on the European political stage, giving the entire Jun kingdom a style of resurgence. Mutually. However, some people think that Joseph II is a time traveler regarding his administrative actions, but Franz thinks that it is more accurate to say that he is the reincarnation of a P-agency war criminal. After Joseph II came to power, he clicked on all the skill trees that would promote radical thoughts, such as multiculturalism, religious freedom, free trade, protection of human rights, protection of speech, electoral bureaucracy, emancipation of slaves, compulsory education, and militarized police. The one above belongs to the P-agency fan version, and here is the normal version. Joseph II's behavior even makes people think that he is a time traveler. First of all, he demanded that all aristocrats' autonomy, judicial power, and economic tax exemptions be abolished. At the same time, they must be Germanized, madly promote the German language, and stipulate that officials must be able to speak German. Then came the serfdom system. Queen Lisa had basically liberated the serfs in the royal territory during her reign, but Joseph II felt that this was too mild, and he demanded the immediate emancipation of all serfs in Austria. Joseph II not only struck hard at the aristocracy and serfdom, but also did not spare the church, which had always been an ally. He closed 60% of the monasteries in Austria and confiscated a large number of church assets. Moreover, the church is no longer subordinate to the Holy See or even to the Catholic Church, but has become a national civil servant. All bishops must be loyal to the emperor. Archbishops are directly appointed by the royal family. Anyone who cannot perform state functions is required to return to secular life. Enforcing freedom of religious belief. Jews can even support pagan weddings in Vienna churches, and even say that as long as citizens do not violate the laws he established, they are free to believe in Satan. Of course, Joseph II would not let go of the small bourgeoisie who had always supported him. He used an extremely exaggerated police system to stipulate the code of conduct for all citizens from birth to death. For the most loyal military, we still have to vigorously retire a large number of veterans. At the same time, he stipulated a lot of codes of conduct. For example, in order to curb the trend of duels within the empire, he stipulated that anyone who participated in or accepted a duel must be executed. To write all of this in detail would require 1 to 2 chapters. In addition, book friends, don't be afraid. These words are added later and there will be no charge. Needless to say, the consequence was that he offended everyone he could offend. But in a country as bizarre as Austria, even such a monarch who is so eager for quick success still has a large number of supporters around him. The domestic political situation was dominated by the reformists, who were the earliest Josephites, but history is full of accidents. Within a few years, the Austrian Empire was inexplicably involved in the Russo-Turkish War. While the two Austrians were fighting fiercely, their old rival Prussia took the opportunity to announce an alliance with the Sudan, and the Magyar rebels also took the opportunity to revolt. Faced with the precarious and corrupt situation, Joseph II had no choice but to compromise, and finally died in despair and isolation. His epitaph reads, "Those buried here, despite their best intentions, accomplished nothing." Although this ruined and half-reputed monarch has left, the Josephite faction has not disappeared, but still has a very strong influence. Hardline element among them even advocated ethnic equality and the elimination of Magyar traitors. Yes, this person is the Minister of War, Count Girol. However, the entire Austrian military hierarchy somewhat believes in Josephism. Mr. Alfred, if I were you, I wouldn't be ridiculous. Everyone here must know very well that for many years we Germans have been caught between the French hammer and the Slavic anvil. After finally defeating the damn Corsicans and his swarm of locusts finally got a chance to breathe, because the presence of Austria made the three parties reach a delicate balance point. If one day this balance is artificially broken, then Europe will fall into endless melee again. Otto von Bismarck was never a war maniac, but a wily politician. Otto, what you just said confused me. Can you tell me whether you want Austria to decline or become stronger? Alfred was able to develop a small workshop of 17 people into the most prestigious steel factory in the Rhineland with 130 employees in 7 years, which shows that this person is by no means mediocre, but compared with the future iron-blooded prime minister, his pattern is still not enough. The experienced Bismarck did not give a direct answer, but asked rhetorically, Mr. Alfred, do you think the Josephites will repeat the same mistakes this time? Alfred Krupp scratched his head. He never thought that this group of losers would succeed, because the arrogant attitude of the Germans in the Austrian Empire made it difficult for them to reconcile with other nationalities. But after careful consideration, the future steel tycoon answered, it should be possible. After all, you are an unparalleled talent, isn't it? Chapter 285 The Grudge Between Krupp and Austria. Bismarck raised his teacup smiled and did not answer. There is a legend that Bismarck participated in the Prussian mission as a private and made wild remarks at the Vienna Peace Conference, 1839, Turkish-Egyptian War, claiming to surpass Metternich. Many people regarded it as a joke or as a self-marketing tool for the farmer, but Alfred Krupp believed that this young man had this energy. He met countless people throughout his life, whether they were arrogant Viennese purchasers, greedy British officials, or even self-righteous French people, who were not even qualified to lift shoes in front of the young man in front of him. At this time, Alfred Krupp seemed to suddenly think of something again, and continued, "You said the Austrians are looking for talent? What kind of talent are they?" After hearing this, Bismarck nodded, took a sip of tea and said, "Aren't you?" After hearing this, Alfred Krupp smiled and sighed in his heart that he had indeed seen the right person, so he also took a sip of tea. "The Austrians did reach out to me and were very willing to spend money. In fact, France's idea of recruiting Krupp was purely taken for granted. To be precise, it was caused by inherent impressions. The idea of building an arsenal in Tyrol was brewing in his mind, and he happened to think of this famous artillery king in later generations, so he slapped his forehead and decided to let people buy firearms and artillery. Obviously, this was difficult for Krupp, who had been making farm tools and tableau. Having never done any research, he had no idea that the entire Krupp steel workforce at this time only had 67 employees, and that the person responsible for recruitment and procurement missions even asked for 3,000 rifled guns and 20 cannons. Thinking this was a deliberately provocative and humiliating move, the first meeting between the two parties ended in an unpleasant atmosphere. When Franz learned the truth, he secretly regretted it and immediately changed his strategy. He planned to recruit him to his banner with the promise of being the steel project leader, but he was sternly rejected by the other party in the name of patriotism. This has to mention the unreliable negative impression left by the Austrians on Alfred Krupp. When he first took over his father's business, he had only 5 smelters and 2 blacksmiths, and the factory's business could barely make ends meet. Krupp's economic situation was very bad. All his properties included a semi-closed factory, a house worth 750 thalers, a cow, and several pigs. Alfred Krupp wrote in his diary, "If even one of the crucibles breaks or overturns, we will be broke and even homeless on the streets. I have to be secretary, letter writer, cashier, craftsman, smelter, cockamaker and night watchman, and all I do is make people the family has a good meal." So Alfred Krupp has developed extraordinary sales talents since he was a child. He always takes some home-produced tableau with him when traveling, because a professional buyer can tell important information about materials and workmanship from these simple tools. However, he ran into a wall once in Vienna. Almost all the buyers he met there thought his kitchen utensils were not exquisite enough, so they would not place orders for agricultural tools from his factory. Unwilling to fail, Alfred Krupp gritted his teeth and hired a sculptor to carve exquisite patterns for his tableau. When he met with the buyers again, they scolded them in a mocking country tone. "It's not tableau at all, but a fragile work of art." It was obvious that the other party, who had a high self-esteem, did not take him, a poor boy from the Rhine, seriously at all. In the end, Alfred Krupp could only leave Vienna in despair. Then in 1840, he got another opportunity to cooperate with the Imperial Mint in Vienna. The Imperial Mint needed a new rolling mill, and after negotiations between the two parties, the price was set at 20,000 florins. Historically, due to its own poor economic situation, defaults on payment for goods happened from time to time even in the heart of the empire. Although the economic situation has improved in this life, the old problem of Austrian officials has not been eradicated. To be fair, 20,000 florins may not hurt the Austrian Empire, which was growing in strength at this time, but for Krupp, who was anxiously waiting for payment, it was an unacceptable loss. If the matter had only ended here, Alfred might not have left an unforgettable memory. But goddess luck suddenly played a joke. Just when a special person in Vienna was about to pay for the goods, the rolling mill broke down. Lost. The outraged mint official demanded compensation from Krupp and even threatened to jail him. Alfred's family had no choice but to pool their money and pay 100,000 florins to the Austrian Imperial Mint to redeem it. After everything returned to normal, Alfred Krupp finally received the belated payment from the Austrians, but what he received was 20,000 expected Austrian banknotes. This transaction almost eliminated the Krupp Steel Company from the world, so since then his hatred of the country Austria has become stronger and stronger. However, these series of accidents were not planned by Franz at all. After all, he was not sinister enough to harm a legitimate steel merchant. And if he had to do it, Franz would do it more thoroughly, so that he would never have a chance to turn around. Not only you, but also many professors, soldiers, and businessmen in the German Confederation were invited, and even a high school student named Helmholtz. The Austrians offered him a scholarship of 2,000 florins per year, and brought his family to Vienna. This baseless solicitation soon aroused Bismarck's interest. After investigation, he discovered a terrible fact, that is, people recruited by Austria will make some amazing achievements soon after arriving in Austria. It made him more convinced of his judgment. Scholarship of 2,000 florins every year? Alfred Krupp seemed a little incredible. At that time, 2,000 florins was definitely a huge sum of money, equivalent to 20 years' salary of a soldier, and 70 to 80 in later generations. 10,000, that's right, 5 times that of the University of Berlin. In fact, the so-called scholarships offered by most universities during this period were nothing more than a reduction of some tuition and miscellaneous fees, as well as a small living allowance, which usually did not exceed £5 per year for particularly outstanding students. The school will provide or introduce them to jobs to help them. For example, the famous Sir Isaac Newton completed his studies at Cambridge University through work study. What about him now? Helmholtz? I haven't heard any rumors about this man. I haven't heard that he made any amazing discoveries or actions, but he was invited by the Royal Society of Science in Vienna as a student. Even if there is, we have no way of knowing. You should know how much you want to join this society. Disaster. Alfred Krupp couldn't help but take a breath after hearing this. Chapter 286 Bismarck's Worries. Before leaving, Bismarck took out a package and handed it to Alfred Krupp. The latter opened it with curiosity and doubt, and then stood blankly on the spot. After coming back to his senses, Alfred took out a hammer from the pocket in the nearby storage room. He first tried to gently tap the mysterious object up and down a few times, and then took out a chisel and hammered it hard. Watching Krupp take out one tool after another, Bismarck hesitated to speak. What's wrong? As a steel merchant, isn't it normal for me to carry some tools with me? The former could only nod heavily. After some probing, Alfred Krupp wiped the dark iron with his handkerchief, and then smelled it vigorously with his nose. It seems to be the smell of manganese. This is really a magical masterpiece. Not even the best craftsman in my factory can make such a perfect work. No, not even the British factory. It is simply like God. Made by my own hands. This excited looking industrial tycoon is very obsessed with steel and has always admired the spirit of excellence. This is also an important reason why Krupp Steel can continue to grow and develop, so he does not hesitate to praise the smooth line handicraft in front of him. The words are not surprising. Otto, where did you get this treasure? Is it a sacred relic from the museum, a meteorite given by God, or the latest product of a certain laboratory? Bismarck shook his head and sighed. You'd never imagine it. I found it in an Austrian trash can. What? Alfred Krupp's eyes widened, with an incredulous expression on his face, as if he was questioning the other party's lies. A few months ago, when I was on my way to the Five Nation meeting, I passed by a newly opened department store in Vienna. The item in your hand is a construction waste that was picked up by a scavenger and thrown away by them. I thought it was interesting and brought it back. During Bismarck's trip to Austria, he did not just watch and eat and drink like other Prussian officials, but did his best to conduct on-the-spot investigation in Vienna. In fact, this kind of steel has nothing to do with garbage, but is the most critical material for supporting the ceiling. It is used to complete a special structure that requires high strength. Obviously, this scrap was not recycled after use, but fell into the hands of the scavenger. After weighing it up, He found that the iron block was very handy, so he decided to keep it for himself to crack nuts and deal with stray dogs later. He was accidentally seen by Bismarck, who was wandering around. His knowledge was naturally much higher than those of the scavengers, and he immediately discovered the difference point, so Bismarck paid for it and brought it to this steel-obsessed friend today just to verify his judgment. This is incredible. This is the most perfect steel I have ever seen in my life. Its hardness and impact resistance are unparalleled. Otto, do you know that, if we in Prussia can one day make guns with this steel, what a wonderful day it would be. I can't even imagine. I hope the Austrians will only use them to build houses. Bismarck said worriedly. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace, sneeze. Franz sneezed heavily. Archduke Franz, our Grand Duchess Carolina thinking of you again. Jenny said jokingly, that's my aunt. So, what? Didn't your grandfather also marry his cousin? In this era, there was no concept that close relatives were not allowed to marry. Although some nobles try to avoid incest marriages, as long as the blood relationship exceeds 3 generations, they will no longer care about such things. Historically, Carolina married her cousin, belonging to the Habsburg family's traditional self-produced and self-sold chain. The meeting between Franz and cousin Carolina was completely unexpected. The reason was that the latter wanted to play with her third brother, Archduke Friedrich, and as an incompetent brother, this guy went to the extreme. Brother, I want to ride a horse. Carolina said, my dear sister, riding a horse is not as fun as riding a boat. When I have time, I will take you for a tour of Africa. Let's go out to sea with my new steam battleships, to enjoy the unique scenery. Giant ships and cannons are a man's dream, Friedrich said without hiding the pride in his heart. However, these words left Carolina with a dark streak in her head. My dear brother, God has given you a talent for the sea, but it has turned you into such an incomprehensible person. It adds a boost to the empire, but takes away a good opportunity to add a new member to the family. I really don't know whether to feel happy or disappointed, she said in a teasing and slightly sarcastic tone. You girls are really difficult to understand. Forget it, it's easier to deal with sailors. Friedrich said with a look of disgust. What, are you deliberately trying to find a lame excuse to excuse yourself, because you don't know how to ride a horse? Carolina couldn't help laughing. She was 16 years old this year. Unlike Friedrich, she inherited her mother's hair. Her blonde hair and dark blue eyes made her an iconic German beauty. In addition, this sister is also 10 centimeters taller than her brother, so she likes her little brother very much, especially his unyielding and competitive expression after being teased by her. I can't ride a horse. You really underestimate me. I even rode a dolphin in the sea. Obviously, Friedrich fell into the trap again this time. What? Is that dolphin? A girl of Carolina's age really wanted her family to pay more attention to her, so she said cutely in a casual manner, haha, it's such a ridiculous land creature that you don't even know what a dolphin is. Next time you come to Venice, I'll take you to see it myself. Then, Friedrich took Carolina into Schönbrunn Palace on the grounds that it was too dangerous to ride a horse on the road. After marching to a large open space in front of the palace gate, he asked an accompanying guard to bring a white horse. He felt that not only was the surrounding area very wide, but there was also a meadow not far away, which was perfect for horse racing. But just like his quarrelsome sister said, he really doesn't know how to ride a horse, let alone how to lead a horse. After taking Carolina for a while, both parties felt a little bored. So the two decided to play something exciting. Friedrich slapped the horse's ass hard, and the horse stood up under Carolina's crotch, with its front hooves in the air, and began to run wildly. However, the latter was not thrown off. Instead, he ran wildly along with the war horse. At this time, Franz was discussing buoyancy with a group of friends. He saw the frightened horse under Carolina's crotch rushing towards him quickly. Everyone was trying to avoid it. She was also shouting, "Get out of the way! Get out of the way!" Seeing that the white horse was about to have a fierce collision with Franz, it suddenly stopped, and Carolina on the horse flew directly into the artificial lake. Hey, why are you here? Franz stretched out his hand, and the white horse licked the owner's palm obediently, and then snorted twice at Carolina. who was still struggling in the lake. Only then did everyone realize, after being frightened, that it was Franz's mount, and it was also a birthday gift from Franz. Although Franz's friends did not fall into the water and add insult to injury, each one of them was frightened out of their wits by the scene just now. At this time, they recovered and started to curse the unlucky person who fell into the water. He sighed, worried about the intelligence of his companions. They all seemed to have overlooked a key point. Only the royal family can ride horses in Schönbrunn Palace. Chapter 287 Encounter. After looking at Carolina, who was still struggling in the 1-meter deep lake, she turned around and said to everyone, "Quiet down, everyone. You should look a bit noble." His words still carry weight in this small group, and everyone shut up after hearing this. Franz's requirements for these nobles are very clear. Rights and responsibilities should be unified. Glory and wealth should be unified with obligations. Everyone must be self-disciplined and have a sincere heart to serve the empire. Although he is easily bullied as a rule-abiding person, he is surrounded by top aristocrats, and no one will mess with these people. Take Duelmanin, whose family has the weakest power among them, for example. The loss of a dog in his family disturbed the entire city of Venice. The entire city's military, police and gangsters mobilized to find a pet. Of course, Franz will not make this set of rules into a code of conduct for everyone to abide by. He just hopes that the nobles who have the power of life and death will pay attention to their words and deeds outside, restrain themselves appropriately, and do not be morally inappropriate. We cannot only know how to enjoy rights and forget to bear responsibilities. Hello, lady in the water. Please forgive me for being abrupt. In fact, when you stop moving around, you will discover the principle of using the buoyancy of water to float. After hearing the other party's harmless words just now, Carolina suddenly felt angry in her heart. As the youngest daughter in the family, she has always been regarded as the apple of her family's eye. She fully expected that the handsome young man in front of her would jump into the water to save her, but she didn't expect that the other party acted like it had nothing to do with her, and even used her as an example. How could she, a spoiled child, endure this? But before taking a step, I found that I was no longer sinking. I was shocked, and thought to myself, could it be that my long lost swimming talent was awakened by him? Gentlemen, a few minutes ago you personally witnessed the practice of a physics theorem. When a person has more fat on his body, it is easier for him to float from the water. Of course, don't panic if you unfortunately fall into the river. As long as you breathe in enough air as soon as possible, your body will be slightly less dense than water and you will float up. After listening to Franz's piece of popular science, everyone nodded and praised, and some even gave a thumbs up. Of course, the aggrieved drowning man was definitely not included here. This was obviously a metaphor for his bloated figure. Carolina stood up suddenly, ready to have a serious argument with the boy in front of her. When she stood up, she realized that the clothes on her body had been soaked by the lake water. The thin gauze skirt showed off her figure, causing the crowd of spectators around her to whistle. In desperation, she could only retreat into the water in a hurry. A bunch of uneducated hooligans. This lady. If we are hooligans, then who are you? Haha, are you a shameless horse thief? Looking at the meaningless war of words between the two sides, Franz could only sigh, then took off his coat and threw it into the lake. Hey, you'll catch a cold if you stay in there for too long. HMPH. Carolina looked ungrateful. Seeing this, the teenagers became even more indignant. If Franz hadn't been here, they would have responded with mud to this guy who didn't understand etiquette. Oh, by the way, I forgot to tell you. If you catch a cold, what awaits you will be the doctor's bloodletting and cooling therapy. They will use a knife to cut open your skin bit by bit and look for blood vessels inside. If you accidentally hit a major artery, the consequences will be serious. Faced with this deliberately exaggerated wording, Carolina said proudly, "Do you think I was scared? Since you don't believe it, well, I heard that the palace doctors have developed a new treatment method, and that is leeches. This is a small insect that lives in water and attaches itself to the human body with sucker's epidermis, and then uses 3 fine fleshy palate pieces to cut open your skin. Then it will secrete a special liquid into your body to prevent blood coagulation, and then start to feast. While Franz was describing vividly. He was also making famous movements with his hands. Insect chrysalis moving, but the expression of Carolina in front of him seemed to be a little absent-minded. "Aren't you afraid of this?" He had to hold his forehead because his relative's nerves were so thick. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but worry about the inheritance of his family's bloodline. "I'm afraid. Then why are you still staying in the water and not coming out?" "Because my legs have become numb and I can't unfold them." As she said this, Carolina began to sink slowly and spit out a few bubbles, shaking his head. Franz had no choice but to rush into the water, take off his coat and wrap it around her body, and then staged a plot of a hero saving a beauty. He carried her out of the artificial lake. At this time, Carolina's body and hair were completely soaked by the lake water. She was trembling all over, her face became paler, and she kept coughing water from her mouth. The other teenagers present had different expressions on their faces when they saw this scene. Some were whistling and cheering, some were meditating silently, but no one showed any initiative. Franz, who had no time to care about everyone's expressions, was going to find an open space to place this somewhat delirious beauty. When Carolina woke up in her arms, she saw a handsome young man hugging her. His smooth silhouette, like a statue, looked particularly charming under the sunlight. This is often the case with girls who are just starting to fall in love. Just by looking at the other person, he could make up a bunch of pictures in his mind, as well as the other person's character strengths, completely forgetting about the previous quarrel. Seeing her obsessed expression, Franz had no choice but to pull her hair. Sure enough, the pain wakes people up. After waking up from the dream, Carolina immediately struggled to stand up. After he put her down, she first raised her hand and gave him a slap in the face, then hugged him and kissed him, then ran away in the direction from where she came. Then she turned around and left a message in the distance: "I can still do it. Come back," leaving Franz, who was still thinking about it, alone and messy in the wind. Carolina felt that she had found the real Prince Charming. With her heart pounding, she followed the direction in which she came and found her third brother, but the unlucky Friedrich is being educated with an iron fist by Albrecht. The 158 cm former is no match for the 185 cm latter and can only be pressed to the ground and rubbed. "Damn idiot. How many times did I tell you before leaving? But I didn't expect you to actually lose your sister in Schönbrunn Palace. If I had known this, I should have thrown you into the sea to feed the whales." Albrecht couldn't suppress the anger in his heart and said, "After all, Carolina is the apple of their family's eye. No matter how careless Friedrich was, he shouldn't be so ridiculous as he was today." Fortunately, he was discovered in advance. If the military godfather had known about it, the punishment he would receive would not be as light as it is now. "Brother, you remembered wrongly. Whales don't eat people. Sharks eat people." "Okay, how about starving them for 3 days?" "Really? According to the logbook I have, and what the sailors have seen, whales don't need to eat for 2 or 3 months. Albrecht couldn't stand his brother's overly diffuse thinking, so he punched the other man on the head. "Idiot. I'm not talking about whales with you. You idiot took Carolina to the Schönbrunn Palace without permission. Now that both the man and the horse are missing, what on earth have you done, you bastard?" Albrecht shook Friedrich wildly, and the latter could only say weakly, "No, I just spanked the horse on a whim." "Jesus, you idiot. Why don't you spank yourself?" "Eldest brother, third brother, I'm here." Relatively speaking, Carolina is relatively close to her third brother, because the eldest brother is tall and unsmiling, and his calm and confident expression seems to remind him not to make mistakes all the time. Hearing his sister's voice, Albrecht, relieved, threw Friedrich aside and stepped forward to hug her tightly. "My Carolina, where have you been all day? Why are you covered in water? Wait, whose coat is this?" Chapter 288 Carolina's first love affair. Albrecht may seem rude on the outside, but he is actually a thoughtful person. It is no wonder that his question left Carolina speechless for a moment. While the eldest brother's attention was focused on the younger sister, Friedrich, who had been embarrassed by the previous lesson, quietly got up. His eyes wandered between the stern-faced Albrecht and drowned Carolina several times, and he immediately understood the cause and effect of the matter. The image of her riding a horse and falling into an artificial lake came to his mind, and he couldn't help it. Snickered. What are you laughing at? As a result, he was punched in the head by his elder brother again. Hey, this coat looks familiar. It looks like the one Franz often wears. Could it be that he fished you out of the lake? So, his name is Franz? Carolina said thoughtfully. Yes, and he is not only your nephew, but also very likely to become the future emperor of this country. He is Franz Joseph. I remember my father always mentioned him, saying that he was the best among the descendants of the entire royal family, and he had extremely unique insights in economics, politics, and military affairs. If he takes charge of the empire one day, he will most likely become the greatest monarch in the history of our family. Carolina murmured point at the time. She thought her father was joking, and did not take his praise to heart. Point after all, a sight is worth 100 words. Alexander, who was previously known as a sensible and polite man, revealed his true colors in front of Carolina. If he married that kind of playboy, it would be better to stay in a monastery for the rest of his life. Alexander inherited the advantages of his parents. He was tall and handsome, with the temperament of a soldier and an artist. However, because he had just drank heavily, he felt more like a gangster, which Carolina really couldn't accept, especially the hungry wolf-like expression he showed from time to time, which made her nauseous in her eyes. The Russian crown prince is a narcissist who lacks cultivation. Franz, on the other hand, had a completely different feeling. His handsome, clean appearance and humble and courteous image were much better than the playboy Alexander, and he was also not like his dull father, Archduke Franz Karol. Even compared to his brothers, he is far superior. Albrecht, the burly eldest brother, was already going bald before he reached his 30s. The unsmiling second brother, Karl Ferdinand, wears his monocle all day long, like a scholar who deals with boring books every day, and is so gloomy that he can almost drip with water. The third brother, Friedrich, is as lively as a little monkey who jumps up and down and chirps all day long, but he is less popular with women because he has been with the sea and sailors all year round. The younger brother William is as fragile as a piece of fragile glass. Even a little external stimulation can cause him to have epileptic seizures. If he is not careful, he will fall or even break his bones. Thinking of this, Carolina's thoughts couldn't help but go back to the moment when she was clinging to that strong chest and listening to the beating of her heart, and she couldn't help but blush on her face. Seeing that their sister looked a little dull, the two brothers quickly put their hands on her forehead. Your forehead is very hot. You must have caught a cold. It's better to call a doctor, Albrecht suggested. No, I don't want to be bled by those hateful guys. The frightened Carolina was so frightened that she stepped back repeatedly, but the paternalistic eldest brother carried her on his shoulders without any explanation. You are still talking stupid things at this time. How can you cure your disease without bloodletting? Carolina, who did not listen to the advice, tried to break away from Albrecht's hands on her hands and knees. At this time, the previous discussion with Franz suddenly appeared in his mind, and he couldn't help but say, wait a minute, I remembered. There is a new medicine specially provided by the military, which is specially used to treat colds. Do you want to try it? What kind of medicine is that? What's its name? Allicin. Capsules. I really didn't know that my eldest brother, who has always been rigid and unsmiling, actually learned how to joke. I won't even bite you for this name. Carolina couldn't help but sneered. Oh, really? This was invented by that geek Franz. Friedrich deliberately teased. This kid likes to sit in his study all day long and make these weird inventions, such as the unbearably bitter instant coffee. Albrecht added. Okay, I'll just trust you once. Carolina nodded. Don't you hate eating garlic? Friedrich continued to joke. I'm not a vampire. How can I be afraid? Carolina retorted. Oh, it turns out a little sister is in love for the first time, but I don't know if he will have time to chat with you in the future due to his busy schedule. Friedrich decided to share this big news with his brother as soon as possible. Franz. He's actually not bad. He seems to be particularly good at handling relationships with older women. Albrecht said thoughtfully. Yeah, that kid has a ridiculously good rapport with women. He actually kidnapped a Japanese female student last time. Friedrich had a jealous look on his face. "I've had enough of you two riddlers." Carolina shook her head and smiled bitterly. It was not easy to communicate with these two older men. She couldn't help but sigh that it would be great if she had a sane younger brother or sister who could talk to her. Of course, this is just a wishful thinking. Just as night was about to fall, the three of them left the palace and got on the carriage and drove towards their palace. What the three siblings didn't expect was that Jenny had been quietly following Carolina. She wanted to know the identity of this interesting little girl and left quietly after witnessing everything. Then she intercepted a letter from Archduchess Carolina to Franz. Of course, Jenny didn't have the courage to open her boss's letter privately, but she knew from the latter's frown when he read the letter that the little girl must have caused him great embarrassment. Jenny, you are overthinking. My marriage must be a political union and will not change based on my personal likes and dislikes. Franz's indifferent and cold tone couldn't help but make Jenny feel a little more regretful. It seems that even an emperor's house has a lot of helplessness. In fact, Franz simply sneered at such words because historically the original owner married Princess Sissy on his own initiative, and how could he, who now has the memory of future generations, allow others to control his own destiny? As for Carolina, the daughter of Archduke Karol, Franz only met her once, and she was the most beautiful princess he had ever seen. However, he was only 11 years old at this time, and was far from being able to talk to her. Marriage depends on the age of marriage. Of course, Franz's political marriage theory just now is not entirely a lie. It is normal for a future monarch's marriage to have a political nature. The marriage partner is either a foreign country that can bring political benefits to the country, or it is to stabilize or ease the relationship between the two countries, or it is simply to obtain a legal heir at the very least. The status of the candidates who meet the above conditions must be equal, otherwise there is a high possibility of repeating the mistakes of history. The scene where the entire palace united to fight against the queen will be staged again, and Franz's head will have to be taken by then. It was so painful that it exploded. Not only did this aunt have no political capital, but she was also very close to Franz by blood. He did not want the tragedy of consanguineous marriage to happen again. Chapter 289 Imperial Cemetery, Schönbrunn Palace, Franz's study. Okay, let's put this aside for a moment. Are there any new moves from the British side? As you might expect, the Red Shirt Army's spending in Kabul is almost astronomical, and the Afghans are not trustworthy at all. No matter how many times the British pay protection fees, they will be robbed by local tribes. Jenny still admires Franz's judgment. After all, Britain is known as the harvester of backward civilization, and almost no country can benefit from their hands. This set of methods of drawing one faction in, attacking another and opening the door, free trade, and bringing civilization, has destroyed many countries and nations, or knocked on the door of many markets. It can be said that it has been tried and tested repeatedly. This time, the emir supported by the British not only cannot control the situation in Afghanistan, but also relies on the guarantee of outsiders for his own safety. As the Anglo-Afghan War progressed, the Redwood Army, which once struggled with the mighty Napoleon in Europe, had completely lost the momentum it had in the early stages of the war. At first, the British succeeded in capturing Kabul with overwhelming force and even arrested Dost Muhammad, king of Afghanistan, and placed him under house arrest in India, with almost no casualties on their side. Because the victory came so easily, most British officers and soldiers quickly became intoxicated with enjoyment and fun. They even arranged cricket, horse racing, hunting and other entertainment activities in the city. One night, the officers of the East India Company and their wives attended a lively party as usual. While enjoying the delicious taste of Madeira white wine, they concentrated on watching drama performances including A Midsummer Night's Dream. But at this time, it was on the other side of the world. Central Asia, the capital of an ancient kingdom. An officer wearing a white shirt and black shorts got up from the bed late at night and walked to the study room, then stared blankly at the giant map on the wall. Yes, they had captured all the major cities, and they only lost 200 people to take this capital. Recalling the past made me feel like I was falling into an ice cave. Now that I was trapped in this former palace. Who would have thought that the situation would take a turn for the worse after the conquest? In the 3 months after the occupation alone, at least 2,000 casualties were incurred, so that not long ago they were forced to pay road money to the robbers before the supply line could be restored. This sounds really ironic. How can a winner be coerced by a loser into making huge concessions? A transport convoy of 300 people was easily ambushed while traveling along the Bur Pass. All 150 peaks of baggage were lost, and all the escorting soldiers were executed without a trace point, and now the British Empire actually wants to do business with their enemies. But even so, the indigenous tribes who received protection fees did not do anything with the money, and the integrity of the transportation team was still not guaranteed. Every day someone reports to God. Maybe it will be their turn soon. The officer had a headache after thinking about it, so he simply threw the map and battle report into the brazier, opened the bottle of wine, woke up the dancing girl who was already asleep on the bed, and continued to drink and dream. Continue to have fun with me. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace, Franz study room. Very well done. What we need to do next is to fight a war without gunpowder. Yes, it is a propaganda war. Remember, this time we must highlight the fact that the Afghans actively attacked the British transport convoy and brutally killed the hostages. Ajani did not fully understand Franz's instructions because the former emphasized the importance of Afghanistan's geographical location more than once. It is located at the crossroads of Central Asia and is a strategic location that can be attacked and defended. Aren't you doing this to promote the British? The gentlemen in the upper and lower houses of parliament will definitely put pressure on Whitehall. Wouldn't there be no reason to withdraw troops from Afghanistan? By then they will calm down and start to use Afghanistan as a springboard. We can invade the Qing dynasty to the east, pass through Prussia to the west, and directly threaten the Russian hinterland to the north. Franz did understand Ajani's worries, but in history, the conquerors who tried to annex this mountainous country did not end well, and even the Mongol Empire did not gain any benefit from it. Afghanistan is a veritable graveyard of empires. Starting from the Alexander Empire, every world hegemony including the Persian Empire, Tang Dynasty, Mongolia, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States was unable to do anything about it in the end. The main reason is certainly not the perseverance of this nation or the rugged terrain. In fact, there is only one word at the core: poverty. The land within its territory is barren and the carrying capacity is too low, so invaders often need to bring their own supplies to supply the army. In addition, the most important point is that this area is extremely lacking in valuable commodities, which means that there is nothing worth looting at all. To sum up, the cost of maintaining the occupation after conquering this place is too high. Although it has always been regarded as a strategic location, the terrain and climate conditions in Afghanistan are extremely complex. There are many mountains and deserts, and transportation is very inconvenient. Various shortcomings have led to the weakening of the core ruling power, so it is difficult to form a tradition of centralized power. The infrastructure construction is almost blank, making it difficult for the invaders to organize effective raids. If conditions permit, I sincerely hope that the British will be trapped in the swamp of Afghanistan forever, so that we can free up enough time and energy to deal with their lackeys. Not long ago, Baroque and Lubu Milosebrenovic, with the help of the British both overt and covert, basically put an end to the chaos in Serbia. Now it has become the biggest trouble in Austria's eastern frontier. Grand Duke Franz, I can't understand why you are so afraid of the Serbs. They have been severely weakened by the civil war, and the empire has deployed a total of 80,000 troops in the Belgrade area. The guys on the opposite side had less than 20,000 soldiers. They had almost no cannons, and they were even so shabby that several soldiers shared one gun. Miss Ajani, maybe you have heard this fable. When a mosquito bites a person, it will only make a bump on his arm. Killing the mosquito is just a slap in the face, but some people will not take the initiative because of this. Fight it. What's more, this pest may also be a carrier of deadly diseases. No one wants to be bitten by it while walking in their back garden, right? Ajani had never been too fond of Franz's overly vivid metaphors. Wallachia, Moldavia, Sardinia, the Papal States and the Ottomans were all mosquitoes surrounding him, so why didn't he take the initiative to attack them? Thinking about it, as a qualified subordinate, she still kept this question in her heart. Well, I hope you don't get your hands dirty when you swat mosquitoes. The editors-in-chief of the Times will probably like this news very much. After all, it does not violate their conscience. Then, how many pounds is their conscience worth? Franz, who has rarely relaxed recently, joked, maybe, between 50 and 100. If it is Mr. Thomas Barnes, it will be more, worth about £200. Jenny couldn't help laughing. Thomas Barnes was a very important editor-in-chief in the history of the Times, and he and John Delane were known as the two major editors-in-chief of the newspaper during his tenure. The Times successfully established itself as one of the most important mainstream media outlets in the UK. He paid special attention to editorials, believing that they had the dual functions of leading and reflecting public opinion. Not only that, he is also very good at guiding editorials, so the Times has gained huge authority, even reaching the level of influencing official promotions and political party elections because of this. Many individuals and groups often bribe the editors of the newspaper in order to gain an opportunity to build a better image and a more open career. At that time, the status of journalists was low and their salaries were low. Faced with the endless temptations, it was naturally impossible to hold on to their true intentions, so accepting bribes to write articles became one of the traditions of the Times. They can even ignore the facts and the interests of their own country for the sake of money, such as the famous Gaosheng incident in the Sino-Japanese War of 1884 to 1894. Chapter 290 Scabies disease. For the sake of the long-term stability of Austria's eastern frontier, Franz deliberately created an east-west division in Bosnia, and he thought that his clever design allowed it to maintain a tripartite internal situation. Of course, he has never ignored how important the two major Near Eastern powers, Ottoman and Russia, are in maintaining the fragile balance of the Balkan Peninsula. This is why Austria made concessions and compromises to the two countries at the five-nation meeting and in the previous secret talks in Istanbul. But the direction of history is always so elusive and full of charm. For example, Miloš Obrenović, who should have withdrawn from the stage of history, completed the task of punching the Parliament of 17 with the help of the British, kicked off the difficult task of defeating the Russian puppet Vučić, and successfully suppressed the Bosnian uprising supported by the Ottomans, reunifying Serbia. In fact, it is not difficult to understand after careful analysis. Historically, although the Serbian region continued the excellent matching mechanism of the Balkans, its political situation was relatively stable, and the 17-member parliament also dealt a thorough blow to the Miloš faction, which caused him to remain until 1859. It was restored only in the year, but at this time, due to Franz's east-west division policy, the relocation of the Serbian capital from Belgrade to Sarajevo, and the previous battles, the strength and influence of the 17-member parliament were greatly reduced. And the new Grand Duke Mikhail they elected to power was Miloš's son, so the former, who thought he had the last laugh, turned out to be the weakest link. Vučić, who is supported by the Russians, should have been the biggest winner in this spoils-sharing shuffle. However, in view of the major differences between Britain and Russia on the Strait issue, which has intensified the conflicts between the two countries, coupled with the sharp increase in internal and external pressure on the Tsarist government, it is difficult for him to continue. It is difficult to provide effective support. As for the Bosnians who were supported by the Ottoman Empire, their interests were even less cared about. Although Cunning left Istanbul on the front foot, the British later sent a new emperor, Earl Meriel Taylor. Earl Taylor didn't like his job, let alone the Ottomans. His request was simple, and everything was based on British strategy. Although Sultan Mejid was reluctant and helpless, he could only do it. The Bosnians also became the biggest losers in this game. They went directly from being a first-class person who oppressed all living beings to becoming a pariah who was trampled on at will. Moreover, how can the grievances accumulated over hundreds of years be settled in just one or two sentences? Miloš Obrenović, who refuses to be left alone, seems to be born for troubled times. This chaotic situation full of complicated backroom games made him like a fish in water, and it took only 2 years to return to his loyal Belgrade, disloyal Sarajevo. Of course, Britain, which has experience in communicating with various ruling classes and leaders around the world, is very clear about Miloš's personal current situation. His so-called Greater Serbia is completely whimsical. But even with the help of Britain, it is still whimsical. Whether it is Austria, the Ottomans, or Russia, whose mission is to rescue the Slavic brothers, they cannot accommodate a Balkan power, but the British experience told them that this big Serbist was a person who could be exploited. Nowadays, Austria's series of actions in Italy have been considered by the British Prime Minister to have destroyed the so-called continental balance of power. Like his predecessors, Viscount Melbourne also does not allow any signs of breaking the balance of power on the European continent. Although the Stitch monster is still far from powerful enough to shake Europe, its recovering national economy is enough to arouse London's vigilance. Of course, the politicians in Whitehall do not think that Serbia will be a rival to the Austrian Empire. Moreover, it is not a wise move for Britain to conduct land operations in the Balkans, a quagmire surrounded by powerful neighbors. Its proud Royal Navy is also not wise. It is difficult to play an effective role. Whitehall is a street in London, England. It connects the Houses of Parliament in Downing Street. In and around this street, some British government agencies such as the Ministry of Defence, Foreign Affairs, Home Office, and Admiralty are located here. Therefore people use Whitehall as a proxy for the British executive branch, unless they choose to make a desperate move and assemble a transport fleet to seize control of the Adriatic Sea with the cooperation of warships with quantitative and qualitative advantages, and launch a beach landing on a weak coast. There may be a slight chance of winning, but this is totally worth the loss, and British taxpayers will never agree that the government will waste all their money on this meaningless war. On the contrary, the Austrians' newly expanded overseas colonies were an easier breakthrough point for the British. After all, the other party is not a maritime power at all, and it is also extremely dependent on important overseas strategic materials such as cotton. As long as occupation can bring benefits and meet the need for war to support war, there will be people who support the war, but after all, war still pays attention to the so-called rationality. Even before Japan and Prussia started fighting, they had to find a reasonable excuse, so a reasonable fig leaf was necessary. The fig leaf chosen by Cunning this time happened to be the excuse of supporting the Serbian independence movement. But when he put forward this crazy suggestion, as expected, he was immediately unanimously opposed by his cabinet colleagues. Idiot. Do you want to give up the entire Balkans to those greedy Russians? Support the independence of the Serbians. Think about it carefully with your head. What an unrealistic fantasy this is. At that time, the Russians will naturally liberate the entire Balkan Peninsula in the name of God of all Slavs, but you are still the Minister of Foreign Affairs. The Marquis of Normandy, the colonial secretary, said angrily, "Since Britain has participated in too many wars in the world, not to mention the lengthening of the front line, various urgent letters regarding logistics and personnel consumption are constantly being sent to London. At this time, it is definitely not possible to start a war with Austria, one of the 5 major powers. Smart move. Moreover, once a war is declared against the Austrian Empire, which is the leader of the Holy Alliance and chairman of the German Confederation, it is equivalent to going to war with the entire Germany and Russia. Even France is likely to stand against Britain for its own interests. For the British, this was a war with more losses than gains, and it was also an act that violated the mainland's balance of power policy. Marquis, please open your eyes. If you have read the confidential reports sent by our ambassadors in Vienna and the German region, you should have an understanding of the Austrians' actions in recent years. While they are vigorously promoting the German customs union in the north, they are actively establishing an Apennine customs union in the south. This is a shameless challenge to the great free trade norms, so I can't imagine what will happen next. If they create another Balkan customs union in the east, how should we face it? If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 291 Palmerston's Plan. Cunning still persisted in his assertion. In his opinion, the threat of a rising Austrian Empire across Central Europe was more terrifying than Tsarist Russia, and the presence of the European Prime Minister also made him feel like a choker. Of course, the reason why Cunning spared no effort to sell his private goods to the cabinet members present here has to do with the new labor law promulgated by Austria a year ago, which made the cost of importing Italian indentured slaves soaring for British indentured slave traders. To avoid the risk of being caught, these grey traders bribed the foreign secretary. The Austrians' economic strength is not strong, and their government is always on the verge of bankruptcy. For example, if a person with huge debts really goes bankrupt, then for his creditors or guarantors can't say it's a good thing. Therefore, it is inevitable that the desperate Austrians will turn to the Russian side. Then it will be difficult for us to sanction the Russians. The combined population of these two countries exceeds 100 million people, and their territories are connected. If we want to win on land, they are almost impossible. What we need is a weak Central European stitch monster and an isolated Oriental monster. I think the best way is to let the Russians and Austrians go to war. Viscount Palmerston, who had just returned to London from India, made a shocking statement at his first cabinet meeting. Let the Russians and Austrians go to war? How is this possible? Prime Minister Viscount Melbourne questioned. Although this was also his idea, he gave up, because both countries belong to the Holy Alliance, and it is not in their own interests to go to war with each other. With the Russians' endless desires on the land and consistent short-sighted behavior, as long as they believe that we will support this war, then the group of barbaric Slavs will most likely attack their allies. As long as the two of them, our strength is severely weakened, we can just concentrate on dealing with the French. Palmerston was a diehard supporter of the Russian threat theory, but he also had no favorable impression of Austria as a country. In his opinion, the best outcome is for both Russia and Austria to suffer losses. A weak Europe is what Britain needs most. Palmerston was tough, but not reckless. There is no reason to sacrifice the country's interests when there are problems that can be solved by Russian hands, especially this trip to India and the difficulties encountered by the British Army in Afghanistan made the former Foreign Secretary particularly aware that the costs of fighting deep in the interior are not proportional to the benefits. The cost of just maintaining the occupation was already astronomical, let alone launching an evenly matched war. Thinking of this, he began to admire the Iron Duke Wellington. You said it very well. This is in the interest of the British Empire. If we can make Russia and Austria turn against each other, then the Strait issue can be easily solved. This is really a genius idea. That's right. In this way, the Holy Alliance will be completely disintegrated, and the British Empire's world hegemony will no longer be shaken by anyone. Palmerston's proposal was unanimously supported by the cabinet members, because once the plan succeeded, it would be of great benefit to Britain. Palmerston, who was striking while the iron was hot, made a new suggestion. Gentlemen, in order to save Her Majesty the Queen's brave and fearless soldiers, we should withdraw our troops from the cesspool of Afghanistan. There is no point in continuing to waste time there. If we can promote the internal conflict between Russia and Austria, then there will be no need to worry about the Russians going south to India in the short term. Problems of the subcontinent. However, this proposal was immediately refuted by Prime Minister Viscount Melbourne. No, we must not withdraw our troops from Afghanistan. If the Russians are unable to break out of the Black Sea, they will definitely find another way. There are only a few backward step civilizations between them and Afghanistan. Wait until those Cossacks break out of Zinghay. When we reach the Kush Mountains, it will be too late for us to think about defending. Yes, the current public opinion does not allow us to do this. Damn the Times. They published the tragic death of the Afghan transport team, and they don't know where they got the treaty signed by the army stationed in Afghanistan and the local indigenous people. The Marquis of Normandy added that he really wanted to stop fighting in Afghanistan, because as Palmerston said, the only gains from the war were the corpses of soldiers and sky-high supply bills. But that damn Times got some sensational photos from nowhere, as well as evidence of British troops paying protection fees to Afghan natives. The newspaper news immediately spread throughout the United Kingdom, and even newspapers on the European continent published the news one after another. The majestic British Empire was actually beaten to the ground by a group of Central Asian indigenous people, and even had to pay protection fees. This news was enough to disgrace the cabinet and even affected the general election. The Whig Party's support rate dropped rapidly. If it were not for John Russell's personal relationship with the Queen, it would probably be the Tories' turn to be in power now. These damn reporters and that damn camera technology. Now Britain has to continue to pay for this senseless war. When it came to the fate of the party, even Palmerston was a little helpless, and he also had a sense of luck. He thought that, if the worst happened, he would spend more money and conquer this land in a few years. We should shut down that damn newspaper and shut those stupid pigs up. Palmerston was as tough as ever. He felt that people like Thomas Barnes should be hanged on London Bridge. Even so, the influence of the Times in the UK was too great, and there were complicated circumstances behind it. The interest relationship always leads to nothing in the end. Viscount Melbourne did not expect Palmerston to compromise so easily. He thought it would be another difficult battle point. At this point, the British top brass reached a consensus to support Serbia and try to get Russia and Austria to go to war. Mills was naturally overjoyed when he received the news that the British had decided to support him in retaking Belgrade, but there were 80,000 Austrian troops in the Belgrade area. Even if all the Serbian people are in the army, it will be difficult to obtain benefits. The 20 cannons and 5,000 rifles promised by the British have not yet arrived. At this time, there were only 12 cannons and 12,000 rifles in the entire Serbia. In addition to the 80,000 troops, the Austrians also built many fortresses in the Belgrade area, the largest of which was Belgrade itself. If you look at it this way, then the Serbs will not be able to win in any case, but the British pointed out a clear way to Mills, and that is to use the power of the Russians. Grand Duke Mills, you can completely defeat the evil Austrian Empire with the help of Russia. You don't have to worry about independence at all. With our British Empire as your solid backing, no one can enslave you. Just look at Greece. British envoy Mills said slightly bewilderedly. Chapter 292. Man's calculation is not as good as God's calculation. Vienna, Prime Minister's residence. After a day of useless quarrels with Count Corellet, Prince Metternich dragged his exhausted body back to the mansion. Damn donkey, damn Slavic barbarian. Metternich was really fed up with this kind of daily wrangling. Although the empire's strength was constantly recovering, he would never have the power of Prime Minister Kaunitz. Kaunitz Rittberg, Austrian politician, diplomat, Prime Minister and Prince of the Austrian monarchy from the 7 Years' War to 1792. Long responsible for the foreign policy of the Habsburg dynasty, Queen Maria the Savage chief diplomatic advisor to his successors, a lifelong hostility to Prussia, because Kaunitz met Queen Lisa, and he met Ferdinand I. It was impossible for the Habsburg family to let an outsider like him control the power. Count Korolaf is just a supporting character pushed by the royal family to compete with him. Even if they reach an agreement, they can object at any time if it is not in the interest of the royal family, or if the royal family feels it is not in line with their wishes. Metternich now hoped that Franz could succeed to the throne as soon as possible, but he didn't know whether he could wait until that day. But maybe that kid doesn't need an old guy like him at all, right? Although Franz pretended to accept it humbly every time he attended class, it was impossible to hide it from Metternich, a veteran who had been involved in diplomatic circles for decades, and after several discussions, Metternich knew very well that this young Grand Duke had an extremely determined heart. His persistence in what he believed in was frightening, and he was the kind of certainty that only the craziest gamblers would have. In fact, as a time traveler, Franz will naturally be very sure of some things, such as the development of certain technologies and some major historical events that have not been affected, natural disasters and the like. But Metternich had already determined in his heart that his student would be either Yeo or Shun, or Jianzhou. Either he will become a wise king like Charles V and Queen Lisa, or he will become another Joseph II. Metternich gradually recovered his thoughts. He found that his old housekeeper was very unusual today. He was still chattering in a daze despite his age. Berg, old man, you are still as good at lying as you were when you were young. If you have anything to say, just say it. You know, the work of the Regency Council is still exhausting me. This old butler has worked for the Metternich family for 50 years. He has a very close relationship with the Prime Minister, and he even knows how to pretend to be an honest person in front of his master. But in fact, Metternich left many secret matters to this steward. If he was not a tight-spoken and thorough person, how could he have been in the position of steward for so many years? However, after so many years of being a housekeeper, this was the first time that Berg encountered someone who made such a big mistake, and the gift he sent should also make the master happy. Your Highness, someone sent 500 kilograms of gold today. You also asked me to send you a letter and a piece of gold. Before the old butler finished speaking, Metternich's brows tightened, and he even wanted to curse. You idiot, how dare you make your own decisions? Did you collect so much gold at will? You have been with me for so many years, and you still don't understand this? Tomorrow you pack your things and go home to retire. Master, please calm down. I made my own decision because I'm afraid of delaying your national affairs. It is not too late for you to read the letter and the gift first. The old butler Berg handed the envelope to Prince Metternich. The latter took a deep breath and relaxed his mood. He opened the envelope and glanced at the letter, snorting coldly because he had seen such words too many times. But soon Metternich's eyes widened. He even put on the pair of reading glasses he had not used for a long time, and immediately put the letter in his coat pocket after reading it. Where's the gift? I have asked you to put it quietly in the master's study. Don't worry, no one except me has seen the contents inside. Berg naturally wanted to see what was inside. If it was a bomb or something detrimental to Metternich, that would be a dereliction of duty on his part. Well done. Metternich entered the study in a hurry, without even being intimate with his nth wife. Of course, no one in the entire mansion will ask the Prime Minister why he did this. Although they will not be buried in the garden for flower fertilizer here. If the old butler Berg feels it is necessary, there will be 1 or 2 more corpses in the Danube River tomorrow. It can still be done. An open box in the middle of the study was filled with gold bars, but Metternich walked straight to a small box on the table without looking at it, as if nothing was wrong. Then he carefully opened the box, looked at the documents inside carefully, and suddenly said plausibly, "God bless our Emperor Franz." In fact, Ferdinand I was not a real emperor in the minds of many Austrian officials. He was just a piece of bacon sitting on the throne, and Metternich, who had chatted and laughed with many European monarchs and generals, was no exception. His allegiance has always been to Francis II and his empire. Of course, if a wise king is born in the future, he may not change his mind. It's just that the guy who is mentally unstable and unable to perform his duties is really not worthy of being called an emperor. If it weren't for this incompetent monarch, maybe the empire's reforms would not be delayed, and many decisions would not be missed due to delays. The best chance. Why was Metternich so excited after reading that mysterious letter? The reason is simple. Miloš, who had just unified Serbia, wanted to seek protection from Austria, and was willing to be a lackey of the Habsburg family. In order to show his sincerity, he even offered to send his eldest son Mikhail Obrenović to Vienna as a hostage. In addition, to show his sincerity, he also sent 3 heads. The first box contained the Bosnian leader, Baji Gradiši, the second box contained the pro-Russian leader, Vučić, and the third box contained the British envoy, Baron Mills. In fact, this was not the first time Miloš had done this. He became the Grand Duke of Serbia precisely because of the sacrifice of Karađorđe's head. Although the Karađorđe family became mortal enemies after this, Serbia did gain independence. And as an old Yunby who has repeatedly jumped around all year round, how could he not see Palmerston's tricks? If Russia and Austria go to war, it goes without saying that the main battlefield will be in Poland. Then who will ensure the security of Serbia in the south? Whether we attack the former capital or western Bosnia, where the Croatians are the majority, we have to overcome many difficulties and obstacles, not to mention that the Belgrade fortress itself, which is the key to the Balkans, has 80,000 troops stationed there. Perhaps it is worth trying to take the land route directly to Sarajevo. But Serbia, with its weak foundation, has no intention of risking its fortunes, and lives just for the sake of risk. There is no certainty that the support promised by the unreliable British can be fulfilled. In the game of great power competition, it is wisest to be a spectator. After all, except for fools, most people will not be an amusement park animal for people's entertainment. The Austrians thought he was insincere before, but he gave them sincerity this time. Chapter 293 God's calculation is not as good as mine. Palmerston, who thought he had a chance to win, was still imagining how his irreversible conspiracy would get Russia and Austria to take the bait. When the reversal disappeared in this farce-like reversal point, what he didn't know was that the mastermind behind all this was Franz himself. As the saying goes, the first step is to attack the enemy with the enemy, then the second is to attack the enemy, and then the second is to attack the city point. In fact, judging from the current situation of Russia and Austria, if the furry bear cannot win quickly after the war, it will probably be the first to be unable to hold on point. The Austrian side only needs to keep Belgrade and Galicia intact, and at the same time, use the terrain advantage of the Carpathian Mountains to completely block the opponent point. Even if the Ottoman Empire wants to take the opportunity to get a piece of the pie, it must be prepared to spill blood on Belgrade, otherwise it may be attacked by the Austrian army from both sides. If it rashly attacks the Patna area point, even if a coalition of Turks and Russians captured Patna, as long as the key to the Balkans was still firmly in the hands of the Austrians, the former would not dare to advance rashly, otherwise they would risk being cut off from their retreat at any time. Moreover, the royal family has already approved the proposal to make Archduke Karol the commander of the Belgrade garrison point as the best defensive commander in Austria and even Europe. Coupled with the natural barriers on the terrain and the newly built fortifications and fortresses built by the Austrians in the past 2 years, it is almost impossible to capture such a strong city in this era. The most terrifying thing about the key to the Balkans is that it is not afraid of being besieged at all. With the flow of the Danube and the convenient water transportation, the enemy cannot cut it off even with all their strength. This means that the Belgrade defenders can continuously obtain troops and supplies. What is even more disadvantageous to the enemy is that there is no suitable place to camp around. Getting too close to the fortress meant being exposed to artillery and cavalry strikes, and the natural gentle slope was a swamp of death for attackers. Of course, the opposite side can also use cavalry to quickly move to a safe area, but they can hardly help in siege, let alone deal with the natural enemy of the trench point. If infantry is used directly, it will be useless except for killing people, and the setting of gentle slopes and trenches will make it impossible for the attacker to return point. Unless the city is completely captured in one go, the soldiers behind will have to witness a tragic scene of their comrades at the front fighting to the last man. Finally, choosing to camp too far away from the city not only lacks threat and cannot cause mental pressure on the opponent, but also completely loses the meaning of siege. To sum up, the Austrian defense system in Belgrade was composed of gentle slopes, trenches and bastions. The design significance of the gentle slope is to make it easier for the attacking enemy soldiers to be beaten, which can also be referred to as easier to fight. In addition, it is also a product of the development of physics and mathematics. Because the defenders attack the attackers by shooting from above, the enemy will get closer and closer to the city wall. When attacking the city point, the angle between the sight lines of both sides will also change accordingly, including the angle of the cannon. So in order to solve this situation, the fortress designers designed a gentle slope. Due to the gentle slope, the siege team had to move at an angle to the defenders' artillery fire. Even lateral movement was restricted. This avoids the embarrassing situation where the soldiers on the defending side have to constantly adjust their shooting postures when the attacking side tries to get closer to the bastion, and even end up having to risk their lives by leaning out to shoot. Therefore, the defenders can always hide behind the walls and shoot, and their own gunners no longer have to worry about the other party's damn marksmen. The range and hit rate of artillery in this era are very limited, and artillery is often threatened by skirmishers or sharpshooters. Of course, if you can hide behind walls or bunkers, you can greatly avoid this situation. For example, if the offensive side is facing flat ground, then the defender shooting is a 3D model, and when the opponent steps onto a gentle slope, it becomes a 2D model. This is a huge advantage for the defenders, as it means soldiers and artillery can more easily kill enemy targets for the attacker. No matter how agile the soldiers are, they will be as ridiculous as a turtle in the eyes of the defenders. Friends who have played Battlefield or World of Tanks should know how uncomfortable it is to rush downhill. Secondly, the trenches of this large fortress are not the soldiers' trenches that are 1-1.5 meters wide and 2-2.5 meters deep in our usual sense. Instead, it is a large trench 20 to 30 meters wide and 2 to 5 meters deep. The scary thing about the Belgrade trenches, that it is connected to the Danube River. If it cannot be defended, the embankment can be blown up and turned into a moot point at the same time. The gentle slope also has a function, which is to keep as many attacking soldiers as possible under the defending city. Facing a fortress on flat ground, if the attacking party cannot defeat it, they can still choose to escape point. However, with the existence of this gentle slope, it became a luxury for them to escape with their lives. The only thing left was to hope that the other party was not a red-eyed butcher. The bastion is nothing new, but it was its appearance that made Europe fight sieges for more than 200 years without daring to choose large-scale sieges. Of course, not everyone dared to launch a strong attack on it. For example, during the Napoleonic Wars, the famous Marshal Lannes was stunned. Unfortunately, his legs were blown off during the battle with Archduke Karol, and he died. If you want to capture the bastion, you must have artillery with large caliber and strong penetrating power. Obviously the Ottoman Empire and Russia did not meet this condition. The British Royal Navy is equipped with this type of artillery, but it takes both time and luck to transport heavy artillery weighing several kilograms from the sea to the city of Belgrade over the mountains once the war breaks out. Galicia will also become the main battlefield, but in this area, the Russians also have no advantage point at this time. Austria was not the Austria-Hungary during World War I. The troops had no fighting spirit, and one general was incompetent and exhausted the three armies. During this period, neither the young Archduke Albrecht nor the veteran General Marshal Radetzky were soft specimens. They all had the same characteristics. Not only were they good at attacking, they were also expert in the use of cavalry. The second is the basis of rule. Austrian Galicia was the only region that did not participate in the rebellion in 1848, the other being Tyrol. On the other hand, in the Russian-controlled Poland, there are 3 minor rebellions a year, and 1 major rebellion every 3 years, which have nothing to do with stability. Therefore, Austria can definitely contact the Polish Restoration Organization and make a promise. In this way, Russia's rear may not be peaceful. Likewise, the Jews, Cossacks, Caucasians, Chechens, and Siberians within Tsarist Russia will also be ready to take action. Once Russia falls into decline, Austria can take the opportunity to raise the banner of liberating Poland and form a coalition with it to attack the 3 Baltic countries and the southern Russian steppes. At that time, the Russian army will be overwhelmed and forced to sign an armistice agreement. As for the newly opened overseas colonies, Franz estimated that Namibia would be the first choice for the British. After all, the Austrians discovered gold and diamonds here. At that time, colonization by various countries was mainly about plundering mineral resources, and gold and diamonds were naturally particularly attractive. The so-called Gate of Hell is not just talk. After the British Army occupied Whale Bay, they had to face the problem of supply difficulties. At the same time, they would realize that they had to march inland if they wanted the local defenders to surrender. The harsh local natural environment will greatly weaken the will of the red shirts. Of course, they will also have to face unfavorable factors such as diseases, mosquitoes, and warlike indigenous people. The fortress located inland will also be a nightmare for the red shirts. A storm is almost impossible, and the cost of siege is the lives of a large number of soldiers in recent years. Under the design of Franz, Albrecht and Friedrich, and with reference to the opinions of Archduke Karol, the West African colonies have been centered on fortresses close to the interior, which allows invaders to try to pass through. The quick fix model of capturing the port became a fantasy. Going deep into the interior of Africa to attack fortresses is undoubtedly a bad move. Of course, the best way is to defeat the enemy without fighting, so Franz chose to clarify the stakes with Milus. As a generational hero, the latter naturally cannot be willing to be cannon fodder for the British so he once again resorted to the Gongzi sacrifices his head strategy. It seems to be a self-destructive path, but it has bought time and opportunities for Serbia's development and growth. Chapter 294 Counterattack. Franz knew very well that it was useless to compromise blindly, especially for great powers like Britain and France, which aimed to dominate the world. Of course, given Austria's current situation, it would be unwise to rashly provoke a war or use counter-sanctions. London, UK. Parliament. Whig members strongly advocated Serbian nationalism at the meeting. They hoped that the parliament would pass a bill supporting Serbian national independence. Although this would sacrifice the interests of its ally the Ottoman Empire, it would play an extremely important role in maintaining the balance of power in Europe. The Tories, led by Robert Peel, immediately launched a counterattack. They believed that the Whigs were playing with fire, especially by supporting Russia in sending troops to Austria, which was a bad move among bad moves. For many years, we in the UK have been working hard for peace in Europe. To this end, we must prevent the Slavs from expanding westward, and now you have ruined it all with your own hands. Robert Peel believed that the Whigs were completely destroying the Great Wall. Once the Austrians made concessions to Tsarist Russia, the latter's influence would be unprecedentedly powerful. At this time, Tsarist Russia was not the old empire that was later ridiculed, but an arrogant European military police. Impossible. Belgrade is too important to the Austrian Empire. It is the key to the Balkans, an area that has been competed with the Ottoman Empire for hundreds of years. They cannot give up easily unless the last drop of blood is shed. And we will not let the Russians dominate. The Prussians and French are all pawns that can be used. If necessary, Britain can save Europe again. Palmerston's confidence came from Britain's powerful force, because even the former Napoleonic Empire, which united the entire Europe with a fragile alliance, still could not defeat the powerful Britain. Referring to Napoleon's continental blockade policy, you actually want to involve the entire empire in a meaningless dispute. You are a subject of Britain, not the master. Mr. Palmerston, why do you let our soldiers die for you? Palmerston's reputation had been disgraced due to a certain war before. Although he won, he did not get the results the British wanted. Naturally, all the blame for these crimes was attributed to Palmerston personally. Now he actually once again proposed that Britain go to war with the great powers, and the entire parliament all suddenly burst into booze. Austria and the Ottomans are both our traditional allies of Britain. What you do is a complete betrayal. One member of the parliament stood up and shouted, and his words resonated. Afterwards, there was constant denunciation of Palmerston in the Parliament Hall, but Palmerston seemed not to care at all. So, what? A very disdainful roar made the parliament quiet again. He ignored the surprised and angry members and cleared his throat. There are no eternal friends, and no eternal enemies, only eternal interests. You old antiques should be buried in the ground. Palmerston scanned the audience, but no one dared to look at him. Victory in all previous wars belongs to Britain, and it will also belong to Britain in the future. The audience burst into warm applause, and Palmerston pressed his hand down and continued. The Austrian Empire opened up many colonies in Africa that we thought were uncolonizable or worthless. They even discovered gold and diamonds in Namibia. Gold, diamond, oh my god. What a wonderful colony. Why didn't we discover it? This is a failure of the Colonial Office. When they heard about gold and diamonds, all the MPs' eyes lit up. This is much more profitable than open trade. Gold and diamonds are what they really want, and Palmerston naturally knows this. The maritime power of the Austrian Empire is simply unable to maintain these colonies, and taking them away is as simple as taking candy from a child for the British Royal Navy. Support. Agree. Long live Great Britain. The cause of Serbian independence is just. Justice will prevail. The audience burst into thunderous applause. Russia, St. Petersburg. Naserlov excitedly arrived in the presence of the Tsar, who was dining with Alexander and his new wife, Princess Maximilian Wilhelmina August Sophie Mary. Dinner is very important to the Orthodox Church, and Nicholas I was a very devout believer. He couldn't help but frowned when he looked at the very excited foreign minister in front of him. Seeing this situation, Alexander immediately said, "Do I need to avoid it?" In fact, he wanted to run away for a long time. Eating with his father was a very painful thing, and even the movements of eating were acquired. Nicholas I felt that his son was unreliable. He had fooled around with a prostitute the day before his wedding night. Now that he had just gotten married, he did not want any more conflicts between the two. In fact, Nicholas I looked down upon his son's promiscuity because he was a very dedicated man and had only one mistress in his life, who was introduced by his wife. Of course, there are also rumors that the queen had to ask her best friend to replace her because of physical discomfort. Nicholas I was 205 centimeters tall, while Queen Alexandra was only 160 centimeters tall. Sit down. As the crown prince, it's time for you to hear about national affairs. Alexander had no choice but to sit back and do what he was doing, then turned to look at Princess Mary and raised an eyebrow, who immediately lowered her head in shame. In fact, Alexander was seducing her new wife's maid. The European aristocratic circle at that time was very chaotic. This is just a microcosm, Carol, just say it. There is no need to avoid the crown prince's family. As soon as Nicholas I spoke, all the waiters in the room immediately withdrew, leaving only Alexander, his wife, and 2 of Nicholas I's personal guards. Your Majesty the Great Tsar, the British are willing to support us in the completely great Slavic liberation movement. Our neighbors to the west, the Austrians, have been enslaving our compatriots. This is a time to show your power. Nasserlov recounted the causes and consequences of the Serbian independence movement, and told the Tsar that the British were willing to support Russia in acquiring the territory of Austrian Poland. Before Nicholas I spoke, Alexander played with the chicken bones with one hand and held his chin with the other. Isn't this using us as gunmen? Sacrifice our allies, and then seal the land we defeated to us. As soon as these words came out, Nasserlov immediately blushed. He was a complete pro-British faction. In essence, I feel that recognition from the British is more important than anything else, so naturally I will not pursue those minutiae details. But Alexander's words were like a basin of cold water, which immediately calmed Nicholas I a lot. Although Russia needed to ease the conflict with Britain, it seemed that the gain was not worth the loss at the expense of its allies. But soon everything fell into place as word reached London and St. Petersburg that the Serbs were still willing to remain a client state of the Ottoman Empire. The Whigs had to announce their collective resignation due to this scandal, and the Tsar began to reconsider who his friends were. Miloš withheld aid from the British and did not intend to return it. As for the missing British diplomat Baron Mills, no one cares about it. His body was eventually found in Istanbul. This is another story. Chapter 295 The Future of the Prussians. Prussia, Berlin. Mr. Dresser, please come this way. His Majesty the King wants to see you. Johann Nicholas von Dresser was the son of a locksmith. Dresser experimented with several breech-loading guns at the Paris gun factory between 1809 and 1814, but they were all unsuccessful. After leaving the Paris gun factory, Dresser returned to his hometown of Semelde, and in 1814 he established his own factory to produce flash caps, and made a small fortune. But he never forgot to develop a breech-loading gun dream. In fact, in 1836, Dresser completed the design of a needle-fired breech-loading gun, and its performance exceeded the Hall rifle produced by the Americans. His patent immediately attracted the attention of the Prussian government, which purchased the invention, classifying the needle-fired breech-loader as a secret, allowing Dresser to continue perfecting his invention. Now Dresser has finally broken through several key technologies of breech-loading guns, such as reducing gunpowder gas leakage. This meant the arrival of a new era in which breech-loading guns were not the mainstream weapon. It was indeed a huge advantage for the Prussians to be the first to realize this. Soon the herald and Dresser came to a secret garden in the palace. It was more like a small training ground than a garden, with both targets for shooting practice and a place for galloping horses. Your Majesty the King, I have completed what you wanted. In fact, in the garden, in addition to William IV, there were several senior Junker officials and Prussia's chief weapons designer, General Potsdam, who were all old acquaintances, so Dresser didn't worry too much. General Potsdam said seriously with a very unhappy expression, Mr. Dresser, who else have you told about your invention? Dresser was not an idiot. He immediately heard the danger signal in the other person's tone and said hurriedly, General, I swear to God, I have never mentioned it to anyone who has nothing to do with it. Although General Potsdam had the lowest official position and title except for Dresser, a businessman, he was a very stereotyped Prussian soldier who was unsmiling and serious in his work, giving people a strong and stern impression. Then, please begin. His tone was cold and emotionless, and because of his responsibility, he felt that he was more qualified than King William IV to announce the start of this test point. Although King William IV of Prussia was essentially no different from his father, on the surface he was a very gentle man, and would not pursue a general who was too responsible. However, others still chose to ask the king for instructions first, and the latter nodded to indicate that they could. Start point. Dresa brought a total of 30 rifles of 3 types. The test shooter took out the rifle and conducted a simple inspection. Then he began to pull the bolt and load the rifle and began to test fire to familiarize himself with the field point. After a burst of gunfire, the test firing expert announced to everyone that it was ready to begin. Then, "Please start, gentlemen. We can't wait to see your performance." William IV smiled. "Don't worry, Your Majesty. I recommend Model A to you. Its firepower and range are perfect. It also has a relatively reasonable price and is suitable for equipping large-scale armies." Dresa's flattery did not break the awkward atmosphere. Those Junker officials cared more about the weapon than its inventor. As the first gunshot sounded, the continuous gunfire never stopped. There were only 30 people, but a company fired. "No. It's the momentum of 2 companies." All the senior Junkers present sat up straight. Although they had been serious before, they now realized the true potential of this rifle and why the War Office felt it could change the battlefield. Even General Friedrich Graf von Rangel, who had been dozing, cheered up. He was a veteran of the anti-French war and did not like new weapons and tactics. A fan of Marshall Hill. "Oh my god. What is that? It can fire at least 8 to 10 rounds per minute. Even my best soldiers can't do this kind of thing." The old general spoke what everyone was thinking, and they also foresaw a future in which Prussia punched Austria and kicked France. At this time, even the best musketeer could fire at most 3 bullets in 1 minute, and at the same time, he could not take into account matters such as aiming point, and those testers who have just used the new rifle can fire at a rate of up to 10 rounds per minute and can shoot and reload continuously. This was simply unbelievable to the soldiers at that time. Some people may mention the American Hall rifle, but in fact the performance of this rifle has not been tested in the war, and even because the performance was too unreliable, it was eventually used by the United States. People eliminated themselves for ordinary soldiers on the battlefield. Being able to fire 2 bullets per minute is a good thing, but Dresa's rifle can allow soldiers to fire 5 times the firepower, which has to be surprising. Of course, the surprises are not over yet. The hit rate and power of this rifle have not been affected. It is slightly lower than that of ordinary rifles, but it may be caused by the test shooter's first use. There are only 2 small shortcomings. One is that compared with rifled guns, the range is insufficient, and the other is the common problem of airtightness. However, the Dresa rifled gun has an advantage in range compared to the common Chauvelin Brown Bess. As for the airtightness issue, it has been improved countless times compared to those previous smoothbore guns, and it is no longer a big flaw. Dresa designed 3 different types of rifles, but in terms of performance, the performance of the 3 rifles was actually similar, so the Prussian government decisively chose the cheapest design, while the care and maintenance, Dresa said, were ignored. After some haggling, the price of this 1841 Dresa needle-fired rifle was finally set at 50 florins. This price is nearly double the purchase price of the M183 August rifle developed by Austria's chief weapons designer, which is difficult for many senior officials to accept. "Oh, damn it, we have 200,000 troops in Prussia, but it's ridiculous that we spend the same amount on rifles as Austria." War Minister Gustav von Rauch could not sit still, because he knew very well that Prussia needed to equip not only the 200,000 standing troops, but also a possible 450,000 reserve troops. Then the cost is 32.5 million florins, which is a sky-high price. Coupled with the high maintenance price of this weapon, he began to understand why Dresa recommended to them Model A, which is relatively more expensive, but has lower maintenance costs. Rifle, dear Mr. Rauch, the Austrian Empire has 420,000 standing troops, which is more than double ours. If Prussia wants to gain an advantage in future wars with Austria, this great invention is necessary. The future Minister of War Hermann von Goyn said that he was a typical hawk who advocated toughness both externally and internally. It advocates both resisting external humiliation and punishing national traitors internally. William IV and a group of Prussian senior officials believed that this new weapon was the future of Prussia, so it was naturally impossible to ignore Orch's concerns. In fact, he was forced to resign soon after. Chapter 296 Tyrol Arsenal. Austria. Tyrol in a canyon covered with mountains and dense forests. There are several ancient courtyards. There are steep cliffs on one side and a clear, cold lake on the other side. The scenery of the lakes and mountains echoes the thousands of years of snow and frost, making people feel like they are in an inaccessible wonderland. It's just that a very abrupt fence ruins the aesthetics, and the wooden sign of the Swarovski lumber yard hanging on the gate makes people feel tacky. This seemingly ordinary farmhouse workshop hides a huge secret unknown to outsiders, a secret research center for new weapons. And the final testing of breech-loading guns is being carried out intensely indoors. If you are a sharp-eyed professional, you can tell at a glance that this gun is more complete than Reese's rifle, and even the big problem that plagues the entire world's weapons industry, airtightness, has also been overcome. Although the research center occupies a small area, the advantage is that, although the Sparrow is small, it has all the internal organs. There are not only specialized gunpowder factories and fine iron factories inside, but also a rubber factory, and the sealing rubbering is their masterpiece. Currently, countries around the world, including Prussia, still use the single point hook cutting method to manufacture gun rifling. This method has been used as early as the 16th century, but it has a fatal flaw. That is, it is inefficient. Craftsmen who use this rifling method must use a hook-shaped sharpener that is hard and sharp enough to turn and cut inside the barrel, slowly carving out the rifling one by one. Generally speaking, one rifling needs to be broached more than 20 times. If you want to make a good gun, the same rifling needs to be broached more than 100 times, because the more times you pull, the thinner and tighter the grooves formed. But a barrel usually has 6 to 8 riflings, and at that time it was almost all done by hand. The workload was very scary. However, precisely because of the guaranteed quality, the craftsmanship of gunsmiths is often sought after. Of course, Franz would not adopt this production method. Instead, he suggested the die extrusion method, which is a method that has been used since the end of World War II. In fact, the manufacturing process of this method is not complicated. It is to first drill a hole in the barrel that is slightly smaller than the barrel of the gun, and then use a high hardness die with protrusions corresponding to the bullline, and then use the assistance of a high pressure machine to make it turn and press down in the hole, squeezing the inside of the barrel into the female and male lines. This law has 3 obvious benefits. The first is precision. The rifling produced by the die extrusion method can be worth hundreds of broaching operations by a skilled gunsmith. The second is the unparalleled manufacturing speed. A master craftsman takes his apprentice to hammer out a work that takes a month to complete in this arsenal in only 10 minutes. The speed of rifling, if it is only compared to the production of gun barrels, Franz's small arsenal's daily production of rifled gun barrels has exceeded the total output of the entire German Federation. The third is the price. With the help of the hydraulic press, the entire cost has dropped sharply to only a few tenths of that of a handmade gun. A brand new bullet was also produced in this factory, which was the famous mine bullet, and later generations compared with the past spherical bullets that needed to be struck with an iron rod when loading. The diameter of this conical bullet is slightly smaller than the diameter of the gun bore. At the same time, in order to cooperate with the breech loading gun, Franz added wooden or paper to the bottom of the bullet. Quality bullet casings when loading. Just put the bullet into the gun chamber, close a pull bolt, and pull the trigger. The firing pin stimulates the explosion of mercury at the bottom of the bullet. The gas compresses a cork, causing the bottom to expand, close to the rifling, and seal the gap between the warhead and the gun chamber. The gap prevents gas from leaking out, and allows the warhead to rotate and fly out at high speed under the pressure of the rifling point. This kind of bullet can greatly improve the range and accuracy of the rifle. The range of this currently unnamed rifle can reach a terrifying 800 meters, which is twice that of the M1841 Dresser rifle at this time. The stopping power of the bullet is very good and the lethality is amazing. The rate of fire is as high as 12 rounds per minute. However, this is not a work that satisfies Franz. because the design of metal fixed loading ammunition has been completed at this time. In fact, the earliest metal fixed loading ammunition appeared as early as 1836, but it is different from the modern fixed loading ammunition. It's not directly related. It's a deflection fire bullet, but it does effectively increase the air tightness of the breech loading gun. Franz tried to invent a modern metal fixed loading bullet, but what he didn't expect was that due to the problem of propellant, the power of this bullet was very impressive. Not to mention killing people. There is even a chance that it will not be able to penetrate a target made of hardwood. Later, an engineer proposed using nitroglycerine, which Franz knew was the main ingredient in the yellow gunpowder that was later commonly used. So the engineer named William Ogle was promised $500,000 as long as he could develop a safe propellant. Then the engineer was directly killed during the first test. Due to the special nature of the work, the Austrian government had to declare to his family that he had suffered a mining accident. William Ogle and his two assistants were also the first victims of this arsenal. Franz was well aware of the risks of developing smokeless gunpowder, but he had to do it because the competition in military technology was not if you die, we will die in a war, and there is no room for mercy. Austria's chief weapons expert, Vincenz Augustin, was a very old-fashioned man, but after seeing the invention of the arsenal, he joined the army of military reform. Historically, Austrian artillery has gone astray. Due to the disastrous defeat during the Napoleonic Wars and the military reforms of Archduke Karol, they were shipped artillery extremely. This big is in a physical sense. The Austrians like to build large caliber artillery, but historically their steel making technology was poor, and the steel they produced was of poor quality and expensive. So the Austrians chose to use bronze cast cannons. Yes, they chose the technology of the last century, but after these people's magical modifications, they came up with a front-loaded cannon that fired faster than a breech-loaded cannon. However, casting bronze cannons has always been a counter-current behavior. Finally, with the end of the Austro-Prussian War, the Austrian Empire's dream of artillery also ended. In fact, unlike what many people imagined, the Prussian Krupp cannon not only failed to suppress the Austrian bronze cannon, but was defeated by the Austrian bronze cannon. Of course, Krupp also absorbed the Austrian cannon-making technology. Later, the Krupp cannon showed its prowess in the Franco-Prussian War, establishing its important position in the world's military history. However, at this time, Austria's steel quality ranked first in the world, especially in the field of special steel, which was far ahead of this era. Manganese steel cannons have become an inevitable choice. If other European countries want to mass produce manganese steel, it is not only a technical problem, but also a resource problem, because only Austria and Russia in the entire Europe have large-scale manganese ore. Cannons made of this material did not have alternatives until World War I, so France could safely let these engineers build big cannons. Chapter 297 Combination. However, France did not manufacture weapons on a large scale in Tyrol, because those weapons would completely change the battlefield pattern of the entire era, and even the rules of war. Franz is afraid that, if he interferes too much in the historical process, he will be counterattacked by the times, and then enter a completely unknown era, losing his advantage as a time traveler. After all, human beings' fear of the unknown is rooted deep in their genes, and is not that easy to overcome. In addition to artillery and breech-loading guns, Franz's greatest hope was grenades. In fact, grenades are nothing new in Europe, and even grenadiers themselves are derived from the word grenade. However, the grenades of this era are very different from those of later generations. They look more like the spherical mines of later generations, usually 5 kilograms. 10 kilograms, and 20 kilograms. It's understandable that the 5 kilogram model is about the same weight as the shot put in later generations. It's not a problem for strong people to throw it about 15 meters, but it is a problem for ordinary adults to throw it 7 to 8 meters. As for the 10 kilogram grenade, it is very difficult for even a strong man to throw it 10 meters, and the 20 kilogram grenade is even more outrageous. Franz does not believe that it would be embarrassing for someone to bring a 20 kilogram grenade to the battlefield. In fact, both the 10 kilogram grenade and the 20 kilogram grenade are defensive grenades. The reason why they are so heavy is because they are afraid that the opponent will throw them back. After all, the grenadiers at that time cut the leads of the grenades themselves. In order not to blow up themselves, they usually cut the leads. Leave it longer, which leads to the dilemma of throwing it over and being thrown back by the opponent. Especially in a siege battle, the defender is already in a small space. If another grenade is thrown back and explodes, it will be a huge blow to the soldier's spirit and body. Someone may be able to throw a 5-kilogram grenade more than 10 meters in a straight line, but it is almost impossible to throw a 20 kilograms defensive grenade back to a 3 to 5 meter high wall. However, with the development of rifles and artillery, grenades have gradually faded out of people's sight. Only backward countries like Austria and Russia will use them in defensive warfare. Franz hopes that weapons experts can reduce the weight of grenades to less than 0.5 kilograms, because even the famous wooden handle grenade is only 0.6-0.8 kilograms, of which the weight of the warhead usually does not exceed 200 grams. Austrian weapons experts did not understand Franz's intention, but after repeated tests, they found that, if you want to maintain the lethality of the grenade, a minimum charge of 1.5 kilograms is needed. With the addition of a wooden handle, it can indeed be thrown farther. Even an ordinary soldier can throw it 25 meters away, but this is still not comparable to the distance of a rifle. Franz understood their thoughts, but he could not tell them that trench warfare and street fighting would become the mainstream of war in the future. Even if he told it, no one would believe it. But something happened that shocked Franz. A group of rocket engineers invented the grenade, a magical piece of equipment based on the principle of rodless spin rockets. One of the rocket engineers, Essenborner, built a miniature launcher, which was the prototype of the grenade. This kind of weapon is light in weight, easy to carry, and can also provide considerable firepower. Its range is much higher than the throwing distance of infantry, up to 80 meters, although compared with the 300-meter range of later grenade launchers, 80 meters seems a bit ridiculous, but this does not affect it from becoming a major killer weapon on the battlefield of this era. In fact, the main factors that affect the range are air tightness and propellant. This is a hurdle that cannot be overcome in the development of weapons. However, Franz's understanding of yellow gunpowder was not enough for him to explain its principles to the experts. Moreover, the explosive power of this kind of gunpowder was astonishing, which prevented Franz from conducting experiments himself. In fact, Dr. Schunbein had already invented collodion in Vienna, but he contributed it to the medical industry, used to treat wounds, seal bottle stoppers, etc. Nitrocellulose was the main raw material for the world's first smokeless gunpowder. Unfortunately, Austrian weapons experts selectively ignored this great invention, and of course they were blown away. In fact, Austria still has a long way to go from nitrocellulose to smokeless gunpowder, but Franz is not in a hurry. After all, he is still young. At this time, the most profitable business of the entire arsenal was the sale of rifled barrels. The price on the market was as high as 15 florins, and the quality was far inferior to the products of the Franz arsenal. Therefore, it is impossible to expect Franz to lower the price. After all, the arms business is stealing foreigners' money. As for domestic military purchases, all purchases are at a 50% discount. Even so, selling rifled barrels is still a hugely profitable business. Ruhr industrial area. Alfred Krupp looked at the manganese steel in the crucible in a daze, because its price could completely bankrupt a small businessman, and making a cannon required more than a dozen or even dozens of pots to complete. There is no doubt that no country in the world would accept such a price. He smiled to himself, and could only turn this furnace of molten steel into swords and kitchen utensils. And Werner von Siemens, who could really change the history of Prussia and even the entire European steel-making industry, is still happily making inventions in a prison in Magdeburg. There is a saying that gold always shines. It is apt to describe Werner von Siemens, whose invention in prison attracted the interest of King Wilhelm IV of Prussia. As mentioned above, the Prussian king was a very gentle man on the surface. He could lend money to Krupp to help his family tide over the difficulties, and he also pardoned the inventor in prison. William IV hoped that Siemens could contribute more patents to Prussia. The latter would naturally be grateful for the king's actions and completely ignored Franz's solicitation. Because there is no place in Prussia that is more anti-Austrian than the army. As a captain of the Prussian artillery, Siemens had also received favors from the king, and it was even less likely that he would have a good impression of Austria. Meanwhile, Siemens' release from prison attracted the attention of another man, a farmer from Pomerania. After Siemens was released from prison, he was sent to the Spandau fireworks manufacturing factory. It was an honor to enter the fireworks manufacturing factory in Prussia, because their products would be displayed in front of the kingdom and very distinguished guests from various countries. He loved his new job and used his ingenuity to create several unprecedented fireworks. Those gorgeous fireworks and the annual income of 500 florins made Siemens very satisfied, because he could pay the tuition of his 2 older brothers and take care of their younger brother. One day, a young man with a face as sharp as a knife and a slightly gloomy temperament came to Siemens. "Hello, Mr. Siemens." "Hello, sir. How can I help you?" "If you want to reserve fireworks, you need to wait until next month. You should know that there are many celebrations and festivals recently." "No, sir. I think you deserve better." "I'm sorry, sir. Did I hear you correctly? You mean the fireworks factory employees have better jobs?" "Yes, you heard it right. I hope you can join Mr. Krupp's steel factory." The young man replied in a very firm tone. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 298 Installment Payment. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. Watching beautiful women play pool is also a kind of enjoyment. A Jenny elegantly picked up the cue and bent down to hit the ball. A series of movements were smooth. The graceful figure flashed past like a phantom, leaving only 2 big white ones. The semicircular sphere lingered in Franz's mind. Archduke Franz, what do you think of Solomon Rothschild's proposal? Franz shook his head and said, "No, a dog can't change its habit of eating shit. Can't they just make money honestly? They have to engage in some kind of financial innovation. Isn't 25% interest per year just usury?" In fact, Franz's sewing machine business was booming during this period. The pedal sewing machine not only took away the market of hand-operated sewing machines, but also detonated the entire household machinery industry in one fell swoop. It became the second mechanical product to enter thousands of households after clocks and watches. Historically, it was precisely because of the rapid popularity of pedal sewing machines in various countries that it directly changed the history of the financial industry in later generations. But at this time, the ambitious Solomon Rothschild was trying to change his destiny. A sewing machine priced at 350 to 400 florins is not something an ordinary Austrian with an annual income of 100 to 150 florins can afford. This was the actual national situation at that time. Many ordinary families had to scrimp and save for several years before they had any purchasing power. So Solomon, who had a shark-like sense of smell, was keenly aware of the business opportunities. He approached Ajani and said that he was willing to provide loans to poor buyers and promised to share 40% of the interest income with the royal family. Franz's industry is naturally under the banner of the royal family, but few people think that he is the real boss behind the scenes, and on the surface, Archduke Franz Karol does not seem like someone who can do such a thing. Therefore, people have concluded that Mrs. Sophie is the mastermind behind the scenes, but on the surface it is Ajani who is responsible for the contact and coordination, which makes people very confused closer to home. However, Franz, who has a certain understanding of financial capital operations, does not want to be a lackey of these worms at all, not to mention that 40% of the income is simply a talisman to the palace. The rule of the Habsburg family largely benefited from the support of the people at the bottom. This kind of conspiracy with loan sharks to defraud the people is tantamount to suicide for this country. Ajani was not surprised by Franz's words. After all, the latter always seemed to come up with amazing and wonderful ideas. However, if Solomon Rothschild's advice is adopted, more people will benefit from the convenient sewing machine, which will be more conducive to its promotion and popularization, and the profits and income will also increase rapidly. As an intelligence chief, she can be said to be well aware of matters at all levels of Austria. The current sales growth rate of sewing machines has been exaggerated, but it has not yet reached its potential limit level point. Many people are unable to spend a very high amount of money to cross this high threshold and give up. And the advent of the sewing machine caused the incomes of women who relied on home sewing to plummet. There are only two choices before them, either to immediately consider joining a factory to make a living, or to upgrade their equipment to improve efficiency by purchasing sewing machines. She believes that under the stimulation of the surrounding environment and life pressure, many people will choose to borrow loan sharks, as long as someone is willing to lend to them. Since ancient times, loan sharks have been dependent on power, and the Rothschild family is no exception. It's just that before meeting Franz, Solomon's life was a little too smooth, making him think that he was the king. To be honest, even Jenny felt sad for him at this moment. A former king is still only willing to share a small part of the profits after suffering many head-on attacks. It is really a bit desperate. Archduke Franz, you must have some fantastic ideas, right? After all, I'm in charge of the department store business now. I believe your method can also be applied to other products. Jenny smiled, jumped back and sat sideways on the pool table. I think you should also use your brain. After all, your brain will get rusty if you don't use it for a long time. Franz deliberately scolded. Oh, really? But experts in Vienna said that women should not be too smart, otherwise they will easily follow the path of Satan. It was a consensus in Europe in the 19th century that women should not be too smart. You are bad enough. Satan's route is not suitable for you. Franz joked. Isn't it good to be a bad woman? Jenny took off her shoes and put her feet on the pool table, tilted her head, and looked at Franz, and winked. You should talk to the Archbishop about this. Maybe he can exorcise the devil for you. Okay, let's get back to the topic we just talked about. Solomon's proposal was fine in good economic years, but once the economic crisis like that of 1837 returned, or another food crisis broke out, a large number of bad debts would be unavoidable. What we will see by then is a broken society with a large number of people going bankrupt, a massive weakening of consumption power, factories shutting down, and a large number of workers unemployed. Of course, the crisis will not stop its spread from cities to villages, and eventually the entire empire will fall into a state of semi-paralysis. If there are any more sparks at such a critical moment, it will trigger a disaster. The above analysis made Jana's eyes light up. Although she had spent time and done a lot of homework, she was still far from the level of the former. By closely linking these three seemingly independent events, usually to stimulate consumption, international situation, and revolution, she was not sure whether Franz was an alarmist, but she knew that the financial problem at hand was much more serious than she imagined. Then the solution is to let everyone buy products that are within their consumption range and income ability. That's not entirely true. Economic problems have always been complex and multifaceted, and cannot be solved once and for all with a suitable or universal antidote. Moreover, blind austerity is not conducive to economic development. Perhaps we can adopt an installment payment model. Installment payment? Jenny asked. Yes. For example, a sewing machine priced at 350 florins can be purchased by the other party for a period of 18 months with a monthly repayment of 20 florins. The extra 10 florins will be treated as interest. Franz's explanation made Jana's eyes light up, and then she raised questions. Only 10 florins? Isn't the interest too low? And there are many risks involved. What if the buyer dies or disappears? Miss Jenny, what I proposed is just a concept. The specific operation will of course be done by you or someone under you. I only have one requirement. The total interest collected should not exceed 10% of the value of the goods, and it is best to be able to suppress below 5%. As for how to eliminate risks, whether it is a mortgage or a pre-loan investigation, it is up to you. If you don't do some things, you won't know the results. Jenny jumped off the pool table and walked up to Franz and said, Archduke Franz, there are some things that you can't understand just by looking at them. Chapter 299 Popularity. Franz's sewing machines not only occupied the entire Central European market, but were also sold abroad. Even the United Kingdom, known as the World Factory, was not immune. This kind of profitable business will naturally arouse the envy of businessmen from other countries, so many powerful businessmen will follow suit. However, the design that does not look complicated has turned many people off. Various problems arise one after another. The failure rate is astonishingly high, and repeated comparative studies cannot find a reason. In fact, this is the problem of standardized production. During this period, people have not realized the importance of standardized production. Only a few industries have achieved standardized production of parts. Austria has long since realized the standardization of parts, and the emergence of new hydraulic machines has also made Austria's parts manufacturing industry lead the world. The power of common hydraulic presses in this period was less than 1% of that in Austria. Things like steam forging hammers, which were destined to be eliminated by history, were even less useful. Even if they thought of it, they could not achieve the same effect as the Austrians. One nail is missing, a horseshoe was lost a horseshoe, broken a warhorse, broken a warhorse, lost a battle, lost a country. It is these seemingly inconspicuous parts that have discredited the imitators in various European countries. Of course, if someone suffers, someone will benefit. Austrian manufacturing, Viennese craftsmanship, and craftsman spirit. Franz took the opportunity to publicize it in newspapers, and various chicken soups spread across the European continent. Naturally, this includes the British The Times, the French Century and La Presse. The famous Le Figaro was suspended, Frankfurter News, Good Night, Vienna, controlled by Franz, Berlin Morning Post and other mainstream media added fuel to the fire. The last two were edited by me. Before 1848, Austria and Prussia had strict censorship systems, and there were no newspapers of great influence. After 1842, Prussia did have a Rheinische, but it was quickly banned. Under such propaganda, there will naturally be many more spiritual Austrians, especially in the German and Apennine regions, that are closely connected with Austria. A strange trend of thought is spreading. However, governments everywhere did not pay much attention to this kind of thing, but more and more workers and immigrants came to Austria. And for people who are already in Austria, there is also a strange sense of superiority that is growing, no matter what nationality they are, or whether they are Austrians. Russia, St. Petersburg. Economic recession is an important problem facing Russia now. With the end of the Turkish-Egyptian War, Russian-Turkish trade has become increasingly difficult. Britain already regarded the Ottoman Empire as its own enemy, and of course it was impossible to accept Russia's continued harvest of wool from the Ottoman Empire. The Tsar was very angry, but facing Britain alone overseas, the European gendarmes were overwhelmed, and had no choice but to give up. As a result, the Russians had a surplus of food. Fortunately, the Prussian junker nobles extended a helping hand at this time. However, it rained all night, and the Spanish Civil War ended. The Russians once again lost an important market. At this time, some people in Russia started a business of selling serfs, but what is very ridiculous is that neither the United States nor the French Texas colony refused to accept Russian serfs. Therefore, Russian businessmen could only set their sights on South America. Argentine farmers were suffering from a shortage of white people, so they placed large orders with Russia. However, these serfs were not handed over to the Argentines in the end, because the Russian businessmen ignored one person. That was Tsar Nicholas I. He was an extremely traditional man, and regarded himself as the loving father of all Russian serfs. How could a loving father betray his children? Of course he would keep them at home, and enjoy their happiness. So the Tsar's military police rushed into the homes of those merchants, and threw those who tried to disobey the Tsar's will into prison. In fact, contrary to what many people think, the Tsar did not like killing people that much, but it is certain that these businessmen who were caught will have their skin peeled off. The Argentinians who had not received their serfs wanted to get their deposits back. Tsar Nicholas I not only refused to compensate, but instead detained the debt collectors in preparation for extortion. But this kind of thing does not happen every day. If we want to reverse the economic decline, we need to start from two aspects: increasing revenue and reducing expenditure. Because there are British, Ottomans, Persians, the Khiva Khanate in Central Asia, the Qing Empire, and the British Canadian colonies abroad who are eyeing it. There were dissatisfied aristocrats, radical reformists, Polish restorers, South Russian Cossacks, Caucasus natives, Chechnya, Georgia, Siberian natives and rebels, as well as those restless Jews. In fact, the so-called restless Jews are completely empty targets. For example, 99% of the merchants involved in the slave trade this time are pure Slavs, and some are of German descent. There are no Jews involved at all. The entire country needs money everywhere. The Southern Russian Railway and the Trans-Siberian Railway, which Nicholas I was so obsessed with, have not yet started construction and they cannot get the money. At this time, there were only 2 railways in the whole of Russia. One was built in 1834 at the Nizhny Tagil metallurgical plant in the Ural region by father and son Yefim Cherebanov and Miran Cherebanov, who were craftsmen born as serfs. The track is made of pig iron, has a total length of 854 meters, and is often pulled by horses. The other is a Tsarskoye Selo railway built by the Austrian engineer Gesner, with a total length of 26 kilometers. Because Russia's machinery manufacturing industry was in poor condition at that time, and its traction capacity was not as good as that of horses. Several steam locomotives were built before success. What's even more bizarre is that in the early days, steam locomotives were only used on Saturdays and Sundays, and horses were usually used for traction. This phenomenon did not occur until it ended in 1838. The Petersburg-Tsarskoye Selo Railway runs 2 pairs of passenger trains every day, which are pulled by steam locomotives on Saturdays and Sundays, and by horses on weekdays. It was not until 1838 that all steam locomotives were used. Therefore, if Russia wants to reverse its economic decline, the only way to do this is open source. But here comes the problem again. Although Russia is vast and rich in resources, the products that can be accepted by other countries are really limited. Even before the end of the Napoleonic War, their flagship product in export trade was enamel. The biggest commodities now are grain and timber, and Britain is the largest importer of Russian timber. The Egyptians had also imported large quantities of Russian timber to build their navy, but at this time a large amount of high quality timber could only be sold to the British. Grain exports declined rapidly after the food crisis and the Turkish-Egyptian War. Coupled with the sudden end of the Spanish Civil War, the entire Russian commodity exports entered a cold winter. Franz naturally knew this situation, so he planned to help Russia. Of course, it would not be suitable for a Jew like Sinner or a Pole like a Jani to discuss business with the Tsar. "Oh, Karl, my friend, what wind has brought you here, Tsar?" Nicholas I admired soldiers very much, and regarded himself as a soldier, so he naturally favored Archduke Karol, who was also a soldier. Chapter 300 Gift. Russia, St. Petersburg, Winter Palace. Hello, Your Majesty the Tsar. Long time no see. How are you and your wife? Compared with the enthusiasm of Tsar Nicholas I, Grand Duke Karol was much more rigid and cold. But the former doesn't care, because this is exactly the latter's style. However, the atmosphere of the conversation between the two seemed very awkward. At this time, Queen Alexandra, who was sitting next to her, had to come out to smooth things over. "Dear Karl, why haven't you answered my husband's question? And we've prepared a sumptuous dinner. We hope you'll feel at home." To be honest, it was also the first time for Archduke Karol himself to be a lobbyist. He was an expert at fighting, but he was a mess when it came to dealing with interpersonal relationships. He even had many conflicts with his brother, who was the emperor. Especially after his wife's death, he often locked himself in his study. The only pastime is to take his little daughter to observe military exercises or to have his family's private guards practice. However, this time the apple of his eye was absent from this trip to Russia. Of course it has nothing to do with Playboy Alexander, but she simply didn't understand that her father had specially visited the bitter cold land of Russia for one thing, so she simply hid in Venice. "I came here specifically to give you a gift." Archduke Karol's answer was straightforward. Queen Alexandra looked at her husband with questioning and teasing eyes. This was the first time she saw someone who spoke without mincing words like her husband. Soon the attendants of the Winter Palace presented gifts from distinguished guests from afar. As the boxes like works of art were opened, pieces of exquisite and dazzling jewelry were displayed in front of Tsar Nicholas I and his family. These jewelry are all inlaid with exquisite diamonds, sapphires and precious stones. Obviously the workmanship is impeccable, and there is no doubt that they are priceless treasures, but there was no surprise on Nicholas's face. He felt that a real soldier should not care about these external things. But soon the appearance of a novel thing changed his mind. It was a revolver without a powder pot, containing gunpowder, but the bullets it was equipped with were all strangely conical in shape. There is also a design drawing at the bottom of the box. This immediately aroused the curiosity of the Tsar, and he asked, "Carol, what is this? Is it an American pistol?" As a military fan, he naturally knew about the famous Colt revolver, and he also collected several of them. However, because it is expensive and cannot be equipped with troops, this weapon is not paid much attention to. However, this revolver is obviously quite different from the Colt 1835 he previously collected, such as the difference in workmanship and materials, and the strange shaped bullets. No, this is a pistol produced by us in Austria, modified on the basis of the American Colt. It is far superior to the 1836 Colt in terms of reliability, power, and accuracy. Archduke Carol naturally knew what Nicholasai was most concerned about, but he deliberately let it slip and then changed the subject. This is paper-loaded ammunition, which can speed up soldiers' reloading speed, increase the range and accuracy of rifles, and even change the pattern of war. But words are not valid. Your Majesty, the Tsar, you'd better try it yourself. After Archduke Carol finished speaking, he was about to get the revolver. It saw Nicholasai on the side, was watching with excitement. The spy leader Duke Liubei, who was in charge of the Special Section 3, shouted escort and faced Archduke Carol. Rush away. But just as Duke Liubei ran halfway, he was kicked out by a 1.2 meters long leg. He only felt that his body left the ground, made several tumbling movements in the air, and then fell heavily to the ground. Even the internal organs are about to be squeezed out. In fact, Duke Liubei is not short. He is 175 cm tall. He was once a soldier, but he still looked like a child in front of the tall Nicholasai. You're a spoiler. If you do bad things again, I'll test the gun on you. Nicholas, I treated Archduke Carol as a friend. In addition, he did not think that Austria sent a very prestigious royal elder all the way to assassinate him, seeing that his donkey-like subordinates could not even think clearly about this matter, so I couldn't suppress my anger. Archduke Carol seemed to have noticed that something was wrong with his behavior, and hurriedly handed the box to the owner of the Winter Palace. Your Majesty, I was negligent just now. Duke Liubei is also faithfully performing his duties, which is understandable. Nicholasai didn't pay attention, but passed the box directly. What he is most concerned about now is whether this bullet is as magical as his guests described. Loading the bullet, turning the wheel, the whole sequence of movements was smooth, which made the Tsar feel very comfortable. This gun doesn't have the sluggish feel of a Colt revolver at all. Everything seems so silky smooth. This is of course because Franz's researchers used electroplating technology. It not only enhances the metal texture, but also increases the smoothness between parts, as well as corrosion resistance and other characteristics. Nicholasai, who was in a good mood, picked up a pistol and searched for targets in the palace, which frightened the accompanying officials in the palace. But they didn't dare to make any evasive moves, for fear of making a fool of themselves and angering the Tsar, who would be lucky enough to become a target. Only Queen Alexandra looked at her husband with a smile. She knew very well that he was only declaring his authority as the supreme ruler of all Russia, and at the same time he was also deliberately testing whether these officials were really loyal and reliable. Sure enough, Nicholasai put away his pistol after taking aim for a while. Carol, today we can go to my hunting ground and have a great time hunting. Compared to the wild boars and deer that you guys often hunt, we Russians prefer hunting bears. No problem, but before that I have other gifts to give to your family. Archduke Carol said. What is that? Nicholasai looked very interested, but he was disappointed when he saw some clocks. Although these new pocket watches have both timekeeping and alarm clock functions, but they were nothing new, which greatly reduced Nicholasai's interest. However, the design of the watch made Her Royal Highness the Queen and the children find it very novel. Although pocket watches are not lacking in meticulous and beautiful workmanship, watches are obviously more suitable as decorations. What's more, the latter has another advantage. If you don't want to be seen wearing a watch, you can choose to lengthen the sleeves to completely cover it up. The watch industry in the 19th century was definitely a hot industry, but the transformation of the key technologies of turbulent and escapement had been completed, so the intention of using technological advantages to trigger an industrial revolution could not be realized. After many discussions between Franz and his experts, the best they can do is to use standardized production and industrialization to reduce costs, but their reputation cannot be compared with Swiss watches at all, let alone dominate the European market. Although the Swiss watch industry started late, it has become highly specialized and intensive after more than 100 years of development. Even the pioneers of the Industrial Revolution across the Taiwan Strait were unable to compete with it, and could only resort to desperately raising tariffs to prevent its products from entering the British Isles. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.